in translating that into the particular practices of their faith. I appreciate and am very conscious of the fact that the first step in this process, individual prayer, is much less relevant to some faiths than others. But in particular, it has limited applicability to Muslims and to Jews in our communities. But I hope that they will see this as the logical first step towards a much broader reopening soon.
Jacob Young.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will answer this question together with questions 7 and 8. Our £3.6 billion Towns Fund will play a vital role in supporting our country's economic recovery, investing in housing, in skills, in technology, in culture and in town centres as we move beyond the immediate COVID-19 response. I'm pleased that in the majority of cases, work has been able to continue despite the challenges posed by COVID-19. And later today, my honourable friend, the Minister for Local Growth, will be publishing Towns Fund guidance, setting out the steps that Redcar and all the 100 towns that we have agreed to take forward with these historic deals can proceed.
Jacob Young.
I thank my honourable friend for his ongoing commitment to the Towns Fund, specifically in relation to the up to £25 million for Redcar Town Centre. Does he agree with me that the best use of this money is to help kickstart revenue-generating projects to secure local government finances in the years ahead?
Yeah. Well, I agree with my honourable friend that we want to see economic activity returning to great places like Redcar, and the purpose of the fund is both to provide immediate economic stimulus and confidence to those places, but also to set them up in the longer term for more sustainable economic growth and prosperity. And I've heard his strong representation for a new horizontal pier in Redcar.
We now go across to Alicia Kearns. Alicia Kearns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Local authorities in Rutland and Melton very much welcome the multiple cash injections provided by central government, but they're now turning their attention to how we recover financially from this period. Both Rutland and Melton want a significant boost in domestic tourism and high street business trade. So what funding has my honourable friend considered for local authorities on top of the Towns Fund and pandemic relief so local authorities come back stronger?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, my honourable friend is right to highlight the £27 billion that the government's provided to communities to ensure they have the resources they need as they get through the pandemic. Both Rutland and Melton will receive funding from the £50 million Reopening High Street Safely Fund as they welcome the return of high street activity in the great towns that she represents, like Melton, Uppingham and Oakham.
We now go to Mark Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency of Workington, we're the beneficiaries of Stronger Towns Fund for Workington and Future High Streets Fund for Maryport. Across Cumbria, we've got 9 such allocations, which I'm sure my right honourable friend agrees has the potential to change Cumbria significantly. Does he therefore have a plan to join up the teams leading these bids to ensure that Workington, Maryport and Cumbria more widely benefit to their maximum potential?
Well, I know how closely my honourable friend has been involved in some of those town deals. We want to ensure that we get the maximum economic benefit from this investment, and so my officials are encouraging communities that benefit from multiple town and high street deals to work together to create a convincing and ambitious plan for the future.
We now come to the SNP spokesperson, David Lindham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by thanking the Secretary of State for his warm words in respect of my honourable friend, the member for Eastern Bartonshire, earlier on. All of us in the SNP family, and I'm sure in this wider House, want to see Amy get back to full health. Mr. Speaker, Amy is not just a colleague of mine here, she's one of my closest friends here, and I look forward to her coming back and resume her duties and being in her rightful place. Last year, amongst much backslapping and hurrah from Scottish Tory MPs, the Minister's predecessor came to the dispatch box to announce millions of pounds of Stronger Towns funding, complete with assurances that this money would be banitised. Now, over a year later, the Scottish Government has yet to hear any more about this. Will he confirm his predecessor's announcement that this is still valid, and what the timescale for delivery is on this overdue and promised funding?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I hope that he'll convey to the member for Eastern Bartonshire and her family the strength of feeling and support that she has in the House on all sides. With respect to his question about the Towns Fund, I will make inquiries with my right honourable friend the Chancellor and revert to him on that, but I would draw his attention to the many town and city deals that have happened across Scotland in recent years that have been championed by my colleagues on this side of the House and which are bringing the same benefits to those communities: investments in technology, in skills, in heritage and in town and city centres.
David Linden.
I'm very grateful, Mr Speaker, but I'm afraid that that response from the Secretary of State will sound a bit like backsliding. Many people can go back and look at Hansard, and when there were lots of Scottish Tory MPs in here, there was great promise about some of this money coming to Scotland. And if I'm picking up the Secretary of State right, that seems to be now being pulled away, and I hope very much that this is not going to be used to shore up what was the Red Wall. So can the Secretary of State give me an absolute cast-iron guarantee that this money will be barnetised? Otherwise, those promises last year will seem absolute empty rhetoric.
Well, the honourable gentleman is trying to sow grievance where there is none. I've said that I'll find out from my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, exactly the status of that funding and whether it is going to be barnetised, and I'll revert to him as soon as possible.
Teresa Billy.
Will the Minister agree that protecting the... Question 11, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Greenbelt is very important to all of us, and we continue to maintain strong protections for it through the National Planning Policy Framework. It is clear that boundaries should only be altered in exceptional circumstances and where all other options have been examined.
Teresa Villiers.
Does the Minister agree that if we're to protect the suburban environment, that means not just safeguarding the Greenbelt, but also rejecting proposals for overdevelopment on non-Greenbelt sites like Victoria Quarter in New Barnet or the tube stations at High Barnet and Cockfosters, where they are threatened with high-rise development which is entirely inappropriate for the surrounding suburban area?
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm obliged to the right honourable lady for that question. She is an assiduous campaigner for our constituents in Chipping Barnet. She will know that I can't comment on any individual cases, but applications should be considered in accordance with the development plan. And I can tell my right honourable friend that the Secretary of State did ask the Mayor of London to pay regard to place in the siting of tall buildings. So where there are clusters of tall buildings, it may be more appropriate to site new tall buildings there than elsewhere. So she may with advantage take up that matter with the Mayor of London.
Listen to Booker.
Number 12, please.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for raising this question and would like at this point to acknowledge the commemorations taking place in her constituency to mark the tragic loss of life from the Grenfell Tower 3 years ago. And in the present pandemic, I should say, Mr Speaker, that the residents and others there managed to pay tribute and commemorate with respect and care. I congratulate them for their efforts and to my honourable friend for all of her unstinting work. Mr Speaker, building safety is a priority for this government and for me personally. The government recently announced the biggest change in a generation on building safety, to be delivered through the upcoming Building Safety Bill. Together, with now £1.6 billion of support for remediation of unsafe cladding, we will leave no stone unturned to ensure residents are safe now and in the future.
I'd like to start by thanking you, Mr Speaker, for lighting Parliament green last night for Grenfell. Thank you. I welcome the £1 billion additional funding for the remediation of non-ACM cladding. But as we all know, it's not just a question about the money, it's actually getting the work done. Will my right honourable friend update me on what progress he expects within the next 6 months?
Well, again, Mr Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. She's absolutely right to highlight the pace of implementation as being important. Registrations for the new Building Safety Fund, which opened on the 1st of June, now have reached 458. I'm pleased to say that the draft Building Safety Bill will be published soon for scrutiny, and remediation continues across the estate where it is needed, despite the COVID-19 crisis. We are determined to do all we can to support residents.
We're now going up to South Yorkshire with Clive Betts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In remembering all those who lost their lives at Grenfell and the families and friends who are left behind, could I say to the Minister, it is shocking that 3 years after Grenfell, there are still 2,000 high-rise residential blocks which have dangerous cladding on them. The £1 billion Building Safety Fund is welcome, but it will only remediate 600 of those blocks. It will do nothing to touch lower-rise residential accommodation, dangerous insulation and other fire safety defects, leaving thousands of people worried about their safety and worried about their financial circumstances. So I asked the Minister, will he now go back to the Chancellor and put to him that what we need now is a great deal more cash. The Select Committee says probably up to £15 billion to ensure that all residential buildings have fire safety defects removed within the next 2 years. That's 5 years after the Grenfell disaster.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman's question. As I said in answer to the previous question, pace is crucial in this particular regard, and that is why the Chancellor has made available in this financial year £1 billion to remediate those buildings which suffer from non-ACM cladding. That's on top of the £600 million that we have made available for ACM-clad buildings. The honourable gentleman is right. It is going to be necessary for a great many buildings to be remediated. We would expect some of that funding to come forward from the building owners, so that those who let or are leaseholders in the buildings do not fall liable for the funds. But we believe that £1 billion now to get on with the job will go a great deal along the way of making sure that these buildings are made safe for their residents.
Now comes Shadow Minister Mike Henchman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 3 years on from the Grenfell disaster, when 72 people tragically lost their lives, 245 buildings are cladded in dangerous ACM, and at least 1,700 are cladded in equally flammable material. If the remedial work continues at the same snail's pace, it will take up to 39 years for the work to be completed. Yet, if you want a controversial £1 billion planning application approved, it seems that high-value chicken dinner get things done. Can the Minister advise the House what influence can be applied to quickly make all our high-rise buildings safe once and for all?
Mr. Speaker, well, first of all, let me welcome the honourable gentleman to his place. I think it's the first time since he took up his shadow position that we have sparred across the dispatch box. So it's the first time that we have sparred across the dispatch box, I think, is correct. So let's hold on to that. Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable gentleman is being rather ungenerous. We have made £1.6 billion available to remediate those buildings that need it. 95% of all social sector buildings that had unsafe ACM cladding on them have begun their remediation or have completed it. 40% of private sector such buildings have begun their remediation or have completed it. The other 60% have their plans in train. We want these buildings to be made safe as quickly as possible. That is why we put the money on the table. That is why we will press for action to be taken. That is why these buildings will be made safe under this government.
Dr. Rupaha.
Number 15, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have introduced measures to help tenants to continue to pay their rent. The government is supporting workers by paying up to 80% of their wages. We've increased the amount available to welfare claimants, and we've raised the local housing allowance rate to the 30th percentile of market rents in each area.
Rupa.
thank the Minister for his response, but on the day that Marcus Rashford, a 22-year-old footballer, wrote to all of us in this House raising the spectre of family impoverishment under coronavirus, would he recognise that a substantial proportion of private renters do have dependent children? They're not all bedsit-land stereotypes. And can he bring forward immediately the plans to end Section 21 evictions? Because they are the party of the family. If people are losing their jobs already, they should protect families and homes now.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm obliged to the Honourable Lady for her question. We've committed to bring forward legislation to enhance renter security, and that includes the abolition of Section 21 evictions, but we will do it in a safe and sensible and sustained way. In the interim, the government has worked with the judiciary, with legal representatives and with the advice sector on arrangements to ensure that courts are better able to address those tenants who are in difficult positions. And we have spent £7 billion of money, public money, on DWP to ensure that people can get the help that they need. We're working with the National Residential Landlords Association. They advise me that in the private rented sector, rents have fallen by something like 1% in the latest round of tenancy renewals. So we're working hard across the space, particularly with the private rented sector, to make sure people get the help that they deserve.
16 withdrawn. Shadow Minister Thangan Debonnaire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I associate myself with remarks of honourable members on the victims and survivors of Grenfell. Today, the Treasury Select Committee says that freelancers, new starters and many others have fallen through gaps in the financial support schemes. Local housing allowance doesn't even cover average rents. Anyone with no recourse to public funds won't even get universal credit. Over 1 million people are struggling with rent, but this is fixable. So will the government heed today the calls of Shelter, the Citizens' Advice, Generation Rent, numerous charities and building societies and the Labour Party act now and prevent people from losing their homes in an evictions crisis in the autumn?
Mr. Speaker, as I've made clear, we have worked hard to protect tenants from the prospect of eviction and also to make sure that they have the funds to live their lives. That is why we introduced the furlough system, which provides 80% of people's incomes. That is why we've increased the LHA. It's why we've made available to local authorities £500 million to help those households facing crisis. I think the prospectus of the Honourable Lady, which is simply to kick the can down the road, to pile up costs for people who may not be able to afford it, is not the right one, and I think she should go away and think again.
We now come to the substantive question to be answered by Minister Clark from Kate Osmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Oh, sorry, let's just wait it, right. We've paid an unprecedented £3.2 billion to local authorities to address the pressures that they are facing in response to the pandemic, including £17.9 million to the Honourable Lady's own council, on top of an increase of £13.5 million in their core spending power this year, and have introduced measures worth over £5 billion to help ease councils' immediate financial pressures. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, and I are currently working closely with Cabinet colleagues on a comprehensive plan to ensure Council's financial sustainability over the financial year ahead.
Heading to Kate Osmond. Kate Osmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for his response, but the financial cost of COVID-19 to Enfield Council is expected to be more than £68 million. And the government has so far only funded a fraction of that burdening cost. The Minister is fully aware of the local authority's statutory duty to provide a range of services to their communities. So my question to the Minister is, in the absence of further funding, should local authorities begin making plans for more austerity to fill the funding gap by cutting vital services like libraries, waste collection or adult social care?
Minister.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. The answer to that is unequivocally no, they should not. As I set out in my previous answer, we are working closely with the Treasury on a comprehensive settlement for the sector, which we'll be bringing forward in due course.
Shadow Minister Naz Shah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The recent reports on disparity and the risk of the outcomes of COVID-19 published by Public Health England confirmed that black and minority ethnic communities have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19. What plans does the Minister have to ensure areas that have been badly hit by COVID-19, particularly those with large black and minority ethnic populations, receive the support necessary to recover from the social and economic effects of the outbreak?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. It's a very good and important one. Obviously, that's something which the government has published research on, where it's obviously a fast-evolving situation. We continue to work closely with councils which cover areas of high density of BAME population, including, for example, Bradford. And we want to understand those pressures, and as we do, then we will adjust our response accordingly.
We now go to Seema Malhotra. Seema Malhotra.
Mr. Speaker, Hounslow Council has identified spending pressures of around 15 million and income losses of 95 million due to COVID-19, and the funding gap is rising. With our local authority heavily dependent on aviation, and my constituency seeing the fourth largest number of furloughed employments, how is the government planning to support partnerships between councils, industry and training providers and community organisations to ensure that our economic recovery and community recovery go hand in hand?
Minister.
Well, the Honourable Lady asks an excellent question, Mr. Speaker. It's very important, clearly, that local authorities and business do work together. We have so far allocated a total of over £103 million to Hounslow Council, which is precisely to help make sure that we do indeed support the whole community. That includes, obviously, a very generous settlement of grants for businesses, as well as additional funding worth over £14 million for the council itself. It is vital, clearly, that any authority with any particular issues, for example, linkages to aviation, and where they're struggling to make their books balance, that they should speak to the department, and we will, of course, always be happy to offer detailed advice.
Jeff Smith.
It's in 21, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I will group question 21 with question 22. We are working closely with the sector to develop a good understanding of the pressures that local authorities are currently facing. We've announced £3.2 billion of additional funding. Councils will be able to defer £2.6 billion in business rates payments, and £850 million in social care grants were paid in April in a move aimed at helping to ease immediate pressures on local authority cash flows.
Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Manchester has lost £136 million in revenue this year alone. In Greater Manchester, the funding gap is £406 million. In the UK, it's £10 billion. Now, the Minister just told us that unequivocally, local authorities shouldn't make plans for more austerity. So is he committing to fully fund those gaps?
Minister.
As I explained in my previous answer, we are going to be issuing a comprehensive spending plan which will ensure that we do not leave local authorities facing unmanageable spending pressures over the course of the year ahead. I would point out that Greater Manchester councils have so far received £168 million of additional funding in response to this pandemic, and their core spending power increased in this financial year by £150 million. I know my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, has held detailed talks with Sir Richard Leese, and obviously the offer of an invitation to have further conversations as required always stands.
Earl Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The financial position of Merthyr Tydfil and Caerphilly councils covering my constituency was difficult enough before the pandemic due to years of UK government austerity. So could I ask the Minister to commit that the Welsh Government will receive the funding it needs for Welsh local authorities, and also to commit the funding that the Prime Minister committed to Wales in February to tackle the effects of Storm Dennis, because the impact of the floods and the pandemic have caused a hugely difficult situation for local authorities in my area and across Wales.
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. Yes, the winter storms have now sort of passed from memory, given everything that's happened in between, but they were terrible, and they had a very significant impact on a number of communities, particularly on the west coast of the country. I'm very conscious of that, and we, of course, will commit that the funds which were promised will indeed be paid. Local government is, of course, a devolved matter, and therefore my department don't engage directly with Welsh councils, but they can be rest assured that they will receive their fair share according to the Barnett formula.
Off to lovely Lancashire with Shadow Minister Kate Learn. Kate.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Not so sunny today, I'm afraid. The government made a promise to councils that it would provide full support so they could do whatever it takes to get through the corona crisis. According to the LGA figures released on the 29th of May, councils needed as much as £6 billion to cover the cost of coping with the ongoing pandemic. If things return to normal, that was the promise. However, we all know it's obvious things will not return to normal in July. Will the Minister speak to his Treasury colleagues and keep his promise to cover the deficit faced by councils and prevent them from going over the cliff edge? I recognise the early responses the Minister's given, but he has yet to give a complete commitment to fund the deficit of councils.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. Obviously, we're very conscious of the £9.3 million that we've given to Blackburn with Darwen Council. It is crucially important, clearly, that we do indeed deliver a suitable funding settlement for local authorities. That's what we're working very hard with Treasury colleagues to deliver, and she can rest assured we'll bring further details to this House as soon as we're ready.
24 is withdrawn, so we have a substantive question from Alan Smith. Minister, could you answer the substantive, please?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Supporting the national and local response to COVID-19 has been our top priority since March. We are giving councils the resources they need to respond and have injected £3.2 billion of new grant funding. This includes support for vulnerable people such as rough sleepers, where we have taken unprecedented action. Nearly 15,000 people have been housed in emergency accommodation, including hotels, since the start of the lockdown period.
Going up to Scotland with Alan Smith. Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm grateful for that answer, and in a consensual spirit, because this is a challenge affecting everybody everywhere. Can we recognise the remarkable achievement that was proven when there is political will of bringing rough sleeping all but to zero? But we need to build on that and we need to take it forward. What plans does the Minister have to work across the House to make sure that we can build on that success and end rough sleeping altogether?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the Honourable Gentleman for the way that he asked his question. We have seen a remarkable effort through local authorities, through volunteers, through the homelessness sector and councils of all party political persuasions who have worked together to bring so many rough sleepers and people at danger of sleeping rough off the streets to give them the support they need. We are, of course, working with local authorities across the spectrum to put plans in place to support people into longer-term accommodation. And alongside this, we have announced £433 million to deliver 6,000 units of new move-on accommodation and personalised wraparound support. But I'm always very happy to meet the Honourable Gentleman to discuss this further.
Mark Paulson.
Number 26, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker, helping our towns and cities to develop safe... Oh, I do apologise. Well, yes, sorry, I do apologise, Mr Speaker. Group with 27. Helping our towns and cities develop safe trading environments, particularly on high streets, is vital to this government's efforts to kickstart our economy, get people back to work and get businesses trading again. We continue to examine all the options to revitalise our high streets. I want to spark a vibrant cafe culture to support hospitality businesses, making it easier for them to operate outdoors with seating and tables, for temporary markets to set up, and for the streets to be temporarily pedestrianised. Many councils are already doing these fantastic things, and I'll be publishing our plans shortly.
Mark Paulson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Rugby Town Centre has reopened today with the unique innovation of images of a rugby ball placed on the ground to remind people about the need for social distancing. But as a former salesman, Mr Speaker, I know that you can't sell if you don't tell. So does the Secretary of State agree that in addition to the practical safety measures he's spoken about, councillors must reassure people that the town centres are open for business by accompanying them with an effective local marketing campaign?
Well, our £50 million Reopening High Streets Safely Fund, of which rugby is one beneficiary, does allow local authorities to create communications plans to give people the confidence to get back onto our high streets, to support local businesses and to help the economy move forwards.
Anthony Higginbotham.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This morning I was able to go and see some businesses in Burnley and Padiham and see the incredible work they've done to get themselves COVID secure. But, Mr Speaker, COVID is only one of the challenges facing our high streets, and Burnley has missed out before on the Towns Fund So I wonder if the Secretary of State could reassure me that he is committed still to working with me to make sure that Burnley's local economy is reinvigorated for the long term.
Well, I can give my honourable friend exactly that commitment and help to reassure his constituents. I know that Burnley is benefiting from the historic High Street's heritage action zones. We will also shortly be bringing forward the competitive round of the Towns Fund, where Burnley will be able to apply, and I very much look forward to seeing his application. And I'd like to support and strongly endorse the campaign, I think, of his local newspaper, the Burnley Express, and encourage his constituents to support their local business community by finding time to shop local.
Jane Hunt.
Question 28, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And obviously, I very much welcome the fact that today is a big moment for all our local economies as shops reopen, which is really, really positive news. We have given councils, businesses and communities over £27 billion thus far to support them as we move to recovery from this pandemic. That includes almost £13 billion in business grants, which has so far supported 832,000 businesses, and the £50 million Reopening High Street Safely Fund, which my right honourable friend referred to a moment ago. Today, we are also publishing the guidance on the £3.6 billion Towns Fund, which will enable 100 places across England to make further progress with their town deals.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I refer members to my register of interests. I've welcomed the superb announcements to help business improvement districts with various funds to support local economies through the uncertainty of COVID-19 pandemic. This has been a vital lifeline for Love Loughborough, the bid in my constituency. Given the need to ensure our town centres have the resources they need to get back on their feet, what further steps are being taken to support business improvement districts as the lockdown restrictions are eased? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, bids have a really significant part to play in our High Street regeneration programme and will be even more important given the setback that we've all experienced over the course of the first half of this year. That's why we've legislated to allow bids that were due to reballot this year to continue until March 2021 and have announced £6.1 million in emergency support funding for bids. And I'm pleased that the Love Loughborough bid, not one to be said if you've got a taste for tongue twisters, will receive £12,747 from this additional funding.
Excellent. We now come to the substantive question from Lucy Powell. Minister Pincher to answer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The eligibility criteria for the Building Safety Fund are set out in the prospectus that was published in May, and as you know, the fund was launched on the 1st of June. Where buildings are not eligible, our guidance is clear that building safety is the responsibility of building owners, and we have given expert advice on a range of safety issues and measures that can provide clarity.
Going up to Manchester with Lucy Powell. Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As my friend, the Honourable Member for Sheffield South East, has already explained, the fund is not big enough for demand, and there are many buildings in Manchester that are ineligible. I can't say that word very well. Last week, I met with the residents of Skyline Central 1, whose building won't be eligible because the freeholder has already begun works on the property. Yet the freeholder is passing all those costs on to leaseholders to the tune of £20,000 plus each. So what more will the government do to ensure that leaseholders are not bearing the brunt of removing dangerous cladding from their buildings?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm obliged to the Honourable Lady for her question. I know that she is campaigning doubtily for her constituents. As I have said, we've been absolutely clear that where those buildings are already being remediated, those buildings where remediation was underway before the 11th of March this year, residents, leaseholders should first of all seek to recover the costs from the owner and the owner from the developer of the building where the defects are found. The point of the fund is to get the remediation work underway quickly. But I can quite understand the points that the Honourable Lady has raised, and I'm very happy to talk to her further about that particular case.
Rob Butler.
Number 31, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our £3.6 billion Towns Fund will create jobs and drive economic growth in towns across England, and a new High Streets Task Force, along with our £50 million Reopening High Streets Safely Fund, will help local areas to kickstart the safe reopening of their town centres.
Rob Butler.
The new Buckinghamshire Unitary Council has ambitious regeneration plans for Aylesbury, which has garden town status, with an excellent master plan already prepared. Can my honourable friend confirm that funding will still be available from central government for the imaginative and innovative garden town projects that will make Aylesbury a place that people want to live, work, visit and invest in long after the coronavirus crisis?
Minister.
Yes, I can. Well-planned, well-designed, locally led garden communities play a vital role in helping to meet this country's housing need well into the future. And as we announced at Budget 2020, the government's demonstrated its support for the Aylesbury Garden Town through a £170 million Housing Infrastructure Fund award, which should help to unlock its full potential.
Rob Roberts.
Question 33, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First Homes, our new flagship home ownership programme, will discount homes by at least 30% for local people and first-time buyers, reducing income and deposit requirements. We recently closed our consultation on First Homes and will publish our response very soon. This will add to other government-backed schemes, including Help to Buy, which have supported over 627,000 households since 2010.
Heading to North Wales with Rob Roberts. Rob Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Around this time last year, a friend of mine purchased a property as a first-time buyer. On a purchase price of $275,000, he paid $3,700 in land transaction tax, which is the Welsh equivalent of stamp duty. Had he completed his purchase just 8 miles across the border in England, he wouldn't have paid any stamp duty at all. And I commend my right honourable friend, along with the Treasury, for this policy to assist first-time buyers. But will he join with me in calling on the Welsh Government to raise the threshold for first-time buyers to 300,000 to mirror England, so that young people aren't incentivised to move out of my beautiful Delyn constituency?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, he is right. Delyn is a beautiful constituency. He is right also to point out that stamp duty or land transaction tax in Wales is a devolved matter. Wales and the Welsh Government is not particularly successful at building houses, including social homes, where I think they've built less than 140 in the last 5 years. Could do a little better, I think, is the message to the Welsh Government. But I'm very pleased to tell my honourable friend that in England, stamp duty relief means that 80% of first-time buyers will pay no stamp duty at all, and that cuts the price of 95% of those who do pay the tax. This relief has benefited over 500,000 people since its introduction 3 years ago.
Now come to topicals, Felicity Buchan.
One, please.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday marked 3 years since the tragedy of the Grenfell Tower fire. No words will ever be enough, but my thoughts, and I'm sure those of the whole House, are with the survivors, the bereaved, and the community of North Kensington. Over the weekend, I laid a wreath beside the tower on behalf of the government. We will continue to work to ensure this tragedy can never happen again. Once again, I want to thank everybody across local government for their continued and dedicated response to COVID-19. We've backed these efforts with £3.2 billion of additional funding, and I want to reassure today councils that I'm working closely with Cabinet colleagues on a comprehensive plan to ensure their financial stability for the remainder of this year, and I'll be saying more shortly. Finally, Mr. Speaker, as many shops reopened their doors to the public this morning and we look to the next phase of our recovery, my department will be leading efforts to revitalise our local economies with a collective determination to realise Britain's enormous potential.
In order to get our high streets back up and running, we may need a temporary relaxation of licensing laws, for instance, to get more tables and chairs out on pavements. Now, clearly, we don't want a free-for-all, but what steps is my right honourable friend considering?
Well, I'm very sympathetic to the argument that my honourable friend has made. I would like to see more outdoor seating, for that to be easier and cheaper for small businesses to get licences for, more temporary markets, more pedestrianisation, and for it to be easier to do things like put marquees outside pubs for longer this summer. All the things we need to do to help our economy to get going in the summer months. And I will be working with local councils to bring forward our proposals very shortly.
Shadow Secretary of State, Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State is caught up in a cash for favours row that now reaches inside number 10 Downing Street. But last week, he didn't even have the courage to show up and answer questions in this chamber. So I hope he'll be answering now. Given the gravity of the allegations surrounding his unlawful decision on the West Ferry development, will he agree to make a full statement to the House, publish all correspondence and disclose all conversations with other government ministers and officials relating to this case to reassure the public that the integrity of the planning process cannot be auctioned off at Conservative Party fundraising dinners?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, propriety in the planning system is extremely important, and I take my responsibility as Secretary of State very seriously indeed. The application to which he refers was a highly contentious one. All the applications that come before the Secretary of State are highly contentious applications. This one had been contested for many years. In fact, it had only come before ministers in my department, before my predecessor in April, because Tower Hamlets Council had failed to determine it themselves. I took that decision in good faith with an open mind, and I'm confident that all the rules were followed in doing so. It isn't unusual for a Secretary of State to come to a different conclusion to a local authority. It isn't unusual for a Secretary of State to come to a different conclusion than a planning inspector. No disrespect to the great people who work there. My predecessors did so on a number of occasions. All of the relevant information relating to this matter is with the Cabinet Secretary, and I have taken and will take again advice from my Permanent Secretary about what further documentation we might be able to publish. But as he says, we want to ensure that the correct processes of the planning system are followed, and so that means publishing documents bearing in mind the legitimate interests of the parties to this case, which remains a live planning application.
Brian.
Back in March, the Chancellor rightly told the House that event hire companies with business properties would be eligible for rate relief and the corresponding grant in the leisure and hospitality. However, subsequent guidance from this department excluded these companies. So can I ask the Secretary of State to clarify the position? Because at present, we have neighbouring local authorities in my part of Hampshire making different decisions for the same firms. Or does he think the new discretionary grant fund is the way to go? Because right now, my local authority will do neither without the Secretary of State telling them they can.
Well, my understanding is that the new discretionary fund would allow a business such as the one that he's raised. I know he's written to me in the past asking for further clarification to benefit from that, but I'm happy to go back to him once again and ensure that that business has the clarification it needs to receive the funding that it desperately requires at this time.
Liz Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has admitted that giving full consent to Richard Desmond's West Ferry development was unlawful because of apparent bias. So why did he not immediately recuse himself from taking the decision instead of unlawfully trying to force it through?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, let's be clear about the circumstances here. All of the parties to this application, and that includes the Mayor of London, the applicant and Tower Hamlets Council, agreed to redetermine the case at my suggestion, and the court consented to do that, and that is now what will happen. If belying her question is one made in writing, I think, by her honourable friend, the Shadow Secretary of State, as to what the involvement of my department was in this matter, I'm happy to clarify that my department knew about my attendance at the event before I went to it. They knew about the fact that I had inadvertently sat next to the applicant. I didn't know who I was going to be seated by until I sat at the table, and I discussed and took advice from my officials within the department at all times.
Anne Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In beautiful Hastings and Rye, we have seen a noticeable increase in constituents contacting me about being terrified and intimidated, victims of antisocial behaviour from particular neighbours. What measures is my right honourable friend taking to support social housing landlords in dealing with and reducing the increase in this disturbing behaviour?
Well, firstly, let me say that it is completely unacceptable for anyone to feel unsafe or intimidated in their home. Earlier this year, I announced an additional £165 million for the Troubled Families programme to tackle some of the issues that might belie this in terms of antisocial behaviour and help transform people's lives. Later this year, I will be publishing our social housing white paper, which I hope will empower tenants and improve the quality of life in social housing forever. We've also given landlords, the police and councils a significant range of powers to tackle antisocial behaviour, including criminal behaviour orders and community protection notices.
Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Did the Secretary of State know when he signed the planning consent for Westbury that the next day a new levy would come into effect, which would have cost the developers tens of millions of pounds more?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That was a matter of public record. It was referred to in the planning inspector's report that my department received in November, so all parties would have been aware of that.
Debbie Hands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree that the work done with rough sleepers during this crisis presents a unique opportunity, and will he commit to redoubling efforts to bringing together national government, local government, the voluntary sector and crucially employers to make sure we can build on this platform so more rough sleepers can be found sustainable homes and careers and work towards the government's very laudable aim to end rough sleeping for good?
Well, I entirely agree with my honourable friend. One of the great successes, one of the few silver linings during this pandemic has been the fact that working with charities and councils across the country, we've helped to bring in over 90% of those people who are sleeping rough on our streets. That's something we should all be proud of and has undoubtedly saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. But that's just the beginning. I'm now working with the Homelessness Minister and with Dame Louise Casey on a long-term plan to give those people the accommodation that they need to move on and restart their lives. And that begins with working with local councils and bringing forward more than 6,000 new homes.
Returning to Scotland with Tommy Shepherd. Tommy Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State's answers to the members for Croydon and Blaydon are entirely unsatisfactory. He accepts that he acted unlawfully in overruling a local authority to grant planning permission to a wealthy Tory donor, helping him avoid £40 million in tax. Will he now explain to this House how he expects the public to have confidence in planning procedures given his actions, and why he thinks it is appropriate for him to remain in post while a police investigation into his behaviour is ongoing?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm happy to clarify a number of those points, the vast majority of which were factually incorrect. I understand that a Labour member of the House of Lords did make an allegation to the police. That was swiftly assessed by members of the Metropolitan Police, and they informed me that there were no criminal matters to investigate and they had no intention of taking it further, so I'd welcome him withdrawing that suggestion. In terms of the decision, I entirely stand behind the decision that I made. I made it with an open mind because we want to see more homes built in this country, in particular in our capital city, and this development would have led to 1,500 homes, 250 affordable homes. And I would remind the House that this contentious decision came to my desk as Secretary of State because the local council had failed to determine it in accordance with the law.
We now go over to Dr. Luke Evans. Dr. Luke Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hinkley Business Improvement District has worked over the last decade to increase footfall and reduce shop vacancies. In the answer to my friend from Loughborough, he talked about the vision that may well be in place. Could he expand on where they think bids should be in the future of driving places like Hinkley forward post-COVID-19?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. It's a very good one. As he rightly says, bids do have a very important role to play in this regeneration. We see them at the heart of the process of making sure that the High Street comes back stronger from this pandemic, and that we make good progress in making sure the High Street is genuinely fit for the future. That means meeting the needs of modern consumer habits.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the West Ferry development, the Secretary of State has just told this House that the department was advised of the conversation with Richard Desmond at the fundraising dinner before he overruled his own planning inspector to approve the West Ferry development. But, Mr. Speaker, a whistleblower in the department says there is no record of the dinner appearing in official documents. This is potentially a serious breach of the ministerial code, especially as the Secretary of State himself has just admitted that it is a highly contentious application. So will the Secretary of State now confirm when and how he advised the department of this meeting, given the question of bias that this issue raises?
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint the honourable lady with her pre-prepared question, but as she will have heard in my answer a few moments ago, the department were fully informed of my attendance at the event. I discussed with my officials the fact that the applicant had raised the matter. Of course, I advised the applicant that I was not able to discuss it, and so I think I've answered her question comprehensively.
David Moore.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend has ensured throughout the coronavirus pandemic that local authorities have been supported and supported well. My own local authority, Sefton Council, has got concerns about future funding arrangements. What more can his department do to help?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his question? We said at the start of the pandemic that we would give the councils who were responding to COVID so brilliantly the resources that they need, and we meant it. We've announced over £3.2 billion of new grant funding, including over £17.5 million for Sefton Council. As I said in earlier remarks, we're going to keep working with councils, including Sefton, to ensure they have the resources that they need.
Final question, Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by, on behalf of all my Liberal Democrat colleagues, wishing very best wishes to the Honourable Member for Eastern Berkshire for a speedy and full recovery. Mr. Speaker, who will make the redecision on West Ferry Printworks development in place of the Secretary of State, and how will they address the concerns of apparent bias expressed by the High Court in its judgment?
Thank you, Speaker. Well, as is usual in cases when planning applications are redetermined, a different minister in the department will be chosen and will make the decision, and he or she, whenever that case comes forward, will do as I did and approach this matter without any bias, with an open mind, and do the right thing.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am now suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order. Order. Urgent question, Greg Clark.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Prime Minister to publish the review of the 2-metre social distancing rule.
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for his important urgent question. As part of our work to slow the spread of coronavirus, the government has put in place social distancing guidance. The guidance specifies that everyone must keep 2 metres away from people outside their household or the support bubbles which have been in place since Saturday. I am grateful to the commitment and the perseverance of the British people in following these guidelines over the past few months, and I know it has entailed huge sacrifice. We keep all of our public health guidance under constant review to ensure it reflects the latest advice from SAGE and the latest evidence that we have on the transmission of the virus. The Prime Minister has commissioned a comprehensive review of the 2-metre guidance. It will take advice from a range of experts, including the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Advisor, as well as behavioural scientists and economists. It will also receive papers from SAGE, which is conducting a rolling review of the 2-metre guidance already. The review will examine how the current guidance is working and will look at evidence around transmission in different environments, incidence rates and international comparisons. Unless and until there is any change to the guidance, everyone must continue to keep 2 metres apart wherever possible and must keep following our stay alert guidance, for example by washing your hands and self-isolating and getting tested if you have symptoms. I am aware there is a great deal of interest, understandably, in this matter from both sides of the House. However, I am sure the House would agree it would be premature to speculate about that review's conclusions at this stage. We will, of course, keep the House updated on this work and will share any developments at the earliest possible opportunity.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Minister, for whom I have a very high regard, for his announcement of the review. But it was nearly 3 weeks ago when the Prime Minister told me at the Liaison Committee that he would commission just such a review and publish it in good time for the reopening of shops and other businesses today. Let me be clear, I do not believe that we should act contrary to a rigorous scientific assessment, quite the reverse. What I asked the Prime Minister for was a scientific review. Among the questions it should consider are, first, science, like the virus, doesn't recognise national boundaries. So what is peculiar about the UK that we've had to have a 2-metre rule when almost all other countries around the world, advised by reputable scientists, have had a smaller distance? Second, what lessons have been learned from countries like Germany, France, Singapore and Australia on their experience of shorter distance rules after a quarter of a year of operating them? Third, many of these countries have a shorter distance rule but require face coverings to be worn. Why is it right for them but wrong for us? Fourth, there's a much lower rate of COVID transmission outside compared to indoors. Why do we have the same rule regardless of setting? Will the review consider the total impact on lives and public health of the 2-metre rule, including the consequences of people being unable to work? And finally, vitally, will it conclude in good time before the 4th of July, so that if more businesses are able to reopen then, including hospitality businesses, they can plan for what social distancing to enforce? Millions of people, workers in pubs, cafes and restaurants, and in manufacturing industry, as well as children going to schools and young adults in colleges and universities, depend on this decision. We're fortunate in this country in having some of the very best scientists in the world. But so far, our outcomes have not always been the very best in the world. Therefore, ministers, officials and scientists should have the confidence, as good science itself does, to rigorously challenge current thinking and to apply lessons from the experience of others.
Well, I am grateful to my right honourable friend, and I can reassure him that his very kind words about me are reciprocated to him, for whom I, of course, have huge respect, not only in what he's done in his previous roles in government, but also the work he's doing now on the Science and Technology Committee as its chair. He is absolutely right to highlight the importance of essentially striking the right balance, Mr. Speaker, and it is a balance between protecting public health outcomes and public health and also understanding the impact that the restrictions are having every day on businesses, and I am entirely seized of the difficulties of that balance.
In terms of his questions about whether this would take into account the wider impact on society through the impact on business, I can reassure him that given we have, for example, economists being a key group in putting together this review, that is exactly one of the things that we will be looking at here, scientific and medical evidence, but also the economic evidence of it. The work is already underway. He highlighted the timescales on this and the importance of those timescales. Work has been ongoing for some time within SAGE to constantly review and consider the impact of the 2-metre rule and the appropriateness of the 2-metre rule, but I do hear exactly what he says about how important it is that businesses getting ready to reopen get guidance as early as they possibly can to enable them to prepare. And I know that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, is clear that this must report within a matter of weeks. I will, of course, reflect to the Prime Minister the feeling, which I suspect he won't be the only member to convey, that it's important that this is done as quickly and as efficiently and rigorously as possible to give businesses as much certainty as we can. He touches on the differences between different countries and their distances. I mean, the reality of this is, Mr. Speaker, that the UK, Canada, Estonia and Spain, for example, have a 2-metre rule in place. The USA has 1.8 metres, Belgium, Australia, Germany, Italy have 1.5, South Korea 1.4, France and other countries 1 metre. The reality of this is that there is not a fixed science about this. There continues to be a scientific debate about what is the most effective distance. And one of the reasons, for example, that we have the 2-metre distance in place at present is because the scientific evidence from SAGE is that, for example, a reduction in distance from 2 metre to 1 metre would carry somewhere between a 2 and 10-fold increased risk of transmission. That is why we have the guidance in place that we do, but we are very clear that this review will give us the basis to make considered decisions on the most appropriate way forward in striking the balance between public health and economic impact. And of course, in concluding, Mr. Speaker, I would say that as ever with this, advisers advise, and we have some of the best scientific advisers in the world, but we will of course look at the scientific advice from around the world, but ultimately ministers decide, and ministers will decide on the basis of this review and the evidence.
Shadow Minister, Justin Mathers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the Chair of the Select Committee on securing this urgent question today? We all want society to reopen, but we do need to know the basis upon which any changes will be made and when they will be made by. I say that because, as we've already heard, a review was promised by the Prime Minister on the 27th of May, and he said at the time we would get those results before the 15th of June and the reopening of non-essential retail. It is now the 15th of June and that review is nowhere to be seen. So what confidence can we have that this latest review will be published on time? We know the hospitality sector could reopen in England on the 4th of July. The date this review is due, but even if it comes out on time, and as we've already heard, it will still be too late for them to put effective systems in place for reopening on that date. And what about all those businesses that have already gone to great expense in reorganising on the basis of 2 metres? Will they receive financial support if the guidelines change? And as we've heard, we know in terms of social distancing, change the rules and you change the risk. So it's not only critical government follow the science, they also need to be honest with the public about the level of risk that they consider to be acceptable. Can I ask the Minister what evidence will be made available, particularly to those most at risk, in the event that we do see a change to this rule? And it's important this review isn't undertaken in isolation. The government's own scientific advisor and the WHO have said that measures should only be eased when there is a fully operational testing and tracing system in place. Will the robustness of that system be considered in the review? And can he tell us when we will have a fully functioning system with an app in place? And finally, we know that since the 11th of May, the government advice on wearing face coverings has been to do so where social distancing isn't possible. That advice only became compulsory on public transport today. Can the Minister advise why it took a month to make that advice compulsory? The government was too slow on that. They've been too slow on PPE, too slow on testing and too slow on social care. We cannot afford to be too slow on this as well.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful, as always, to the Shadow Minister of State for his remarks and for, as ever, the constructive tone which he always adopts on these occasions. I share his view that we do want to see Britain the United Kingdom reopening for business, but we want to see it reopening for business in a way that is safe for those going out and shopping, and I'd encourage people to go out and frequent their shops from today, but also as and when we are able to safely open hospitality again, that we get it going again, but we do it in a safe way based upon the evidence. In terms of timescales, as the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Chair of the Select Committee, said, and the Shadow Minister has said, we do recognise the importance of getting this information and this decision out there as swiftly as we can, because it is important to give businesses all the time we can in order to prepare for it. But equally, he would not expect me to set a particular deadline while the work is being done. I have said within a matter of weeks, and I have said we recognise the urgency for business, but it's important that those conducting this review can conduct that review properly and rigorously so that it is actually very useful for the decision we have to make. Once that review has reported, of course, and the PM has had the opportunity to consider it, I would, of course, expect the findings to be made public. I would also say, in respect of the WHO and their comments, he's absolutely right to highlight that the 2 metre distance is only a part of the measures and part of the complex package that is in place to reduce risk and to protect public health. As we've seen with different countries around the world, they have adopted different approaches to whether they reduce the distance, whether they impose different requirements in respect of face masks. So in a sense, you've got a menu of different options, all of which can reduce risk, and it's how you come up with the most appropriate balance in reducing risk while also opening up business. And on that committee, as I say, we see economists and clinical and scientific expertise feeding into that balanced picture. As the Chancellor said, I think at the weekend, it isn't binary. We must consider this in the round, taking into consideration all relevant factors. He mentioned test and trace. It is a hugely important part of that armoury of options to chase down this disease and allow our economy to reopen. We made, as he will have seen last week, a very good start in the first week of the operation of the new test and trace system. We also saw, and I would pay tribute to them, a very, very high willingness on behalf of members of the public when asked to self-isolate to do so, and I would pay tribute to everyone who's done that and thank them for doing so. And finally, I would say to the Honourable Gentleman that I believe throughout this pandemic, firstly, we have been learning every day about how this disease behaves, about what is needed to tackle it, and what steps are most effective. I am confident that we have done the right thing at the right time throughout this pandemic, but like any responsible government, of course, there will be lessons to learn. It's important we are willing to learn them.
Sir Ian Duncan.
Mr. Speaker, can I say that my right honourable friend who was successful, I congratulate him on this, because I think this, Mr. Speaker, is significantly the most important strategic decision the government is going to have to make as it unlocks the economy. And the problem is, so much of this debate, Mr. Speaker, has been shaped around the idea of the economy as an economic tool. It is not just economic. The reality is, with our focus on COVID, we are in danger of losing sight of what will happen, probably to the poorest in society, if they start to fall unemployed, suffer depression, serious increased illness. This will have a major effect on the ability of people to be able to manage their lives. So this is not just economic. I urge the right honourable gentleman, it could be 6 weeks before we actually discover the outcome of a review where I don't believe a single fact is going to change in that 6 weeks. The reality is the advisers are all divided. The government must make a decision and get this one right.
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, Mr. Speaker, and I have huge respect for him and for his campaigning on this issue, particularly in the context of the extraordinary work he has done around social justice over many, many years. So it is absolute that he highlights the importance of looking at the impact of COVID-19, not just in the context of immediate health outcomes, but in terms of the broader social and economic impact that it has. He is absolutely right. He's also right to emphasise the need for urgency, and that is exactly what this review will be conducted with. And on his final point, Mr. Speaker. He is right. The science is mixed. There are different scientific opinions, and a balance must be struck with the best scientific advice and consideration of the impact on the economy. And as a great former Prime Minister once said, advisers advise and ministers decide.
Going to Scotland, to the SNP spokesperson, Dr Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The risk of viral spread is not just influenced by the distance between people, but by the length of time they spend together. While research is measured in minutes, people could be sitting in a pub or restaurant for hours. Other factors include ventilation, the activity engaged in, and whether face coverings are mandatory or not. The government can't just wish away the fact that the risk of transmission increases as people get closer and more than doubles from 2 metres to 1. Is it not safer to keep the distance at 2 metres, but work with all sectors to develop protective measures for when this isn't possible? This could be a combination of personal protection in the form of mandatory face coverings and structural, such as using glass or perspex screens between tables in restaurants. We all recognise the impact on the hospitality sector, but surely a second wave would be devastating.
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and before I answer, may I put on record, on behalf of myself and colleagues on this side of the House, our very best wishes to the Honourable Lady, the Member for East Dunbartonshire, for a swift and full recovery, and I hope that the Honourable Lady will be able to convey those sentiments to her when she speaks to her. She's not just a member of the SNP family, she's a member of the family of this House, and we all wish her very, very well. The Honourable Lady is very well versed in these issues and is an eminent clinician in her own right. We have made clear that it isn't just the 2 metre rule taken in isolation that is the only factor. She's right to highlight that broader context. It's not just about distance, it is about duration of contact, how close that contact was, whether there were measures in place to mitigate that, be it screens or other measures, the length of time. So she's absolutely right. And in this debate today, in this urgent question, we must always remember this is not a binary question. It is not just the 2 metre rule or the distance rule and nothing else. We must look at it in the round, as the Chancellor rightly said, and as I believe the First Minister of Scotland has also said in this context. That is exactly what this review will be doing, looking at all those factors in the round to come up with appropriate scientific and economic advice to the Prime Minister and Ministers to take a balanced decision on.
Kevin Holding-Ray.
The Minister is absolutely right that the evidence is changing on a daily basis and that we have a menu of options to deal with the transmission of COVID. Face coverings look increasingly effective. Would it not be worth relaxing some measures, such as the 2 metre rule, which make the pubs and restaurants in Thirsk and Malton and every other constituency financially unviable, and tightening up in other areas, such as requiring the compulsory wearing of face coverings in shops and in pubs and restaurants when you're moving to and from your table?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, my honourable friend makes a very good point, and as ever, a gentle but clear plug for his constituency, and when it is safe to do so, I suspect an encouragement to people to come and enjoy those businesses and that hospitality. And he's right to do so, because I, like every other member of this House, I am sure, has spoken to restaurateurs, those in the hospitality industry, pubs, who are all very clear about the impact that this has on their business and how it operates. We are incredibly sensitive to that, but it does come down to making an appropriate judgment on the scientific evidence, balancing economic impacts and keeping the disease under control. He's right to allude to other measures within that package or that menu of options, which will, of course, be taken into consideration in this review.
Florence Echelon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A number of the businesses in my constituency, just over the river in Vauxhall, were home to a thriving nightlife with the culture of the South Bank. A number of small businesses, the hospitality, the tourism, the creative industries, a number of people who are on freelance contracts, a number of people who haven't been able to get any of the government support over the last few months.
Well stated.
They've all played their part in the lockdown and adhering to those rules. But they are going to be the last sector to be eased up and to open up. the social distancing rule is going to make such a big difference to their ability and whether or not those businesses will survive within the next 3 months. Can I ask the Minister to take into account the particular nature of this sector and to ask what additional impact has been made on the social distancing on these businesses?
Minister.
Well, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right, and I suspect, like other members, she will have had many of her constituents coming to her explaining how this could make a real difference about the financial viability or otherwise of reopening their businesses. And we are incredibly sensitive to that. I think it was the Chancellor who said over the weekend it could make a difference between a third of pubs being able to open up or 3/4, depending on where that distancing level is set. So I am incredibly sensitive to this. But as I've said, it is not a binary choice. There are a number of measures that will be considered in the context of this review. But just as her constituents, I'm sure, would wish, as would mine, it is important we strike that balance between protecting public health and going on the basis of the best scientific and clinical evidence we've got, which is what this review will be looking at, but also balancing that against getting the economy up and running again as soon as we safely can.
Jerome Bay.
Thank you, sir. If our objective is to work towards social and economic normality whilst maintaining our hard-won control over the virus, as the incidence of infection in the general population reduces day by day, will it not be possible to reduce the social distance from 2 metres while still maintaining downward pressure on the rate of infection? And is the acceptable rate of infection below 1 a scientific or political decision?
Minister.
Well, the honourable gentleman, my honourable friend, makes a very, very good point. What we are seeking to do with this package of measures we've put in place to protect public health and press down on the transmission of this disease is exactly that, to see as incidents go down, as infection levels go down, step by step in a cautious way to start relaxing those restrictions where we can to allow businesses to operate. It is quite right and quite understandable. Honourable and right honourable members will have different views on the pace at which we should be going on either one or the other of those, but it is exactly those considerations that this review is looking to investigate.
Monera Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As well as the social distancing rules, as the Minister has already acknowledged, a rigorous system to test, trace and isolate every case is absolutely critical to keeping people safe. Yet the WHO has said the system has yet to be proven robust and effective to easing further lockdown measures. NHS leaders and leading scientists have said test and trace is not fit for purpose. And local authorities that have a critical role in tracing say their remit is still unclear and they don't have the critical data they need. So when will he ensure that all local authorities have the information they need to be able to support test and trace fully?
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable lady, her party's spokesperson on this issue, for that question. I would say that in the first week of its operation, stood up from pretty much scratch, this system has performed extremely well, with 67% of those testing positively contacted, as it were, and responding with the information needed, 85% of their contacts agreeing to self-isolate. There is more to do, of course there is, but that I think is a very positive start to this programme, led by Dido Harding, Baroness Harding, for its first week of operation. In answer to her second point, it is of course right that we continue, as we have done throughout, to work hand in hand with local authorities as well as with other public health authorities.
The gallant member, Bob Stewart.
Mr. Speaker, at least I've got that right this week. Mr. Speaker, not Mr. Deputy Speaker, Mr. Speaker. I've at last acknowledged it. Could I ask the Minister, as we approach, it's very much like my honourable friend's question, as we approach the R figure being towards zero, and it's some places it's getting there, why the heck do we have to have social distancing, face masks on public transport or social isolating? You know, if we get near R, surely we can get back to normal.
Minister.
I'm always grateful for questions from my honourable and gallant friend. What I would say is that the latest figures we have, and this is as of last week, are that R is actually not near zero. It's between 0.7 and 0.9. Now that shows that the infection rate and the transmission rate is going down. but it is still relatively only just below 1. That is why we need to continue to keep the pressure up on this disease and keep transmission rates down. He is right, as my honourable friend alluded to, that as that figure and the transmission rate gets down further, then there are more opportunities to relax step by step in a cautious way the restrictions, but we're not there yet.
Sarah Dines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my honourable friend knows, I represent Derbyshire Dales, where tourism, hospitality and pubs are essential not only to the local economy, but also to mental health of constituents. Will my honourable friend reassure me that these issues will be at the top of the list of factors considered when reviewing the 2-metre rule to enable opening up of pubs, not least, promptly when it's safe to do so?
Minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and she too champions her wonderful constituency of Derbyshire Dales, which I've had the privilege of visiting in the past. She is absolutely right to say it is important we're able to open up pubs and restaurants and other similar businesses as swiftly as we can, but it's important we do it when it is safe and when transmission rates and public health measures suggest it is appropriate to do so.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Scientific analysis is good, but many of his backbenchers have long been arguing for a reduction of the 2-metre distance guidelines without basing that in science. So can you confirm, given that there's economists involved in this review panel as well, enough weight will still be put on the evidence that comes from the scientists, and also perhaps, if there's going to be a relaxation, the public health measures that go alongside that to allow that reduction, and we'll also then, in terms of the economy, look at additional cost to business and consider the additional business support required to accommodate these measures.
Minister. Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. What I would say is actually, and quite rightly, honourable and right honourable friends on this side of the House in their comments about relaxing the social distancing rule are actually reflecting the fact that the science on this is mixed. There is no scientific consensus across the world. There are different distances around the world in different countries, and that is why we have this review underway. And I can reassure him it will consider not only the clinical and scientific evidence, but also the economic impact and evidence. It will look at that in the round, which is, as the Chancellor said, exactly the right thing to do. All of that will be carefully considered, and decisions will then be made by ministers on the basis of that review and the scientific evidence available.
The question from Sir John Redwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the scientific advice is mixed and muddled, and given that the economic and business advice is overwhelming and clear, why don't ministers today announce the halving of the distance, ask business to put in other measures, including protective clothing and screens where appropriate? Because if we want our hospitality industry to survive in any form, they need to know today so that they can prepare their routes and their tables and their screens and all the rest of it. Leaving it till July the 4th means many more lost jobs.
Minister.
Well, the reason, Mr. Speaker, is because the current scientific advice is that the 2-metre rule significantly reduces the risk of transmission, and we have not yet beaten this disease. That is why we are putting in place, or the Prime Minister has put in place, this review to consider not only the scientific and clinical evidence, but exactly as my right honourable friend would expect, the economic evidence and the economic impact as well. But it is right that is done on the basis of a review and on the basis of evidence. But I do hear his very clear plea that the sooner the better for the sake of businesses, and I accept that.
We now go to Kate Osmore. Kate Osmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the lockdown, small businesses in my constituency of Edmonton have planned considered changes to their business model in preparation to reopening in a way that is safe for employees and customers. Not only does that take time, but it is an extra financial burden for small businesses in particular. So will the Minister please confirm what extra financial support is readily being made available for understandably worried SMEs to help cover the extra financial costs associated with reopening?
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful, thank you, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. She is absolutely right to talk about the amazing work that many of our businesses, large and small, have done to get themselves ready to reopen. And I would encourage people following the rules, following the guidelines and social distancing guidance to get out there and support their local shops now they've been able to reopen. As you'll know, the Chancellor has put in place in recent weeks a significant package of support for businesses and individuals. That is still there. It will, obviously, as he's set out, taper in the coming months as the economy is able to reopen more fully. But we have continued to support businesses throughout, and we will continue to do so.
Imran Hamad Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I fully support recent statements by the Prime Minister that as the number of new cases fall, it is right to reevaluate our social distancing measures. In May, South Korea, the government of South Korea, reduced their social distancing requirements to simply 2 arms lengths. It's crucial that we ensure our businesses have the best chance to recover and rejuvenate and be provided with the measures that will best permit them to do so. The Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy recently stated that if we don't reduce social distancing measurements, we will have 3.5 million jobs will remain at risk. Does my honourable friend agree that if it's safe to reduce social distancing measures, then that's the most reasonable thing to do and responsible thing to do?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. He is absolutely right. If and when it is safe to reduce social distancing measures, he is right. It is what we should do, but it is for this review to report and advise us and the Prime Minister on exactly that.
16 withdrawn. Scott Mann.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware that many of my constituents are based around tourism, and that many of those may not be open again in the winter should they find that distances aren't reduced. So first of all, can I ask him to join our Cornish campaign for Think Local, Shop Local? And secondly, can I ask him to employ all possible countermeasures to ensure that our tourism and hospitality sectors can be protected through COVID-19?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that question. He's absolutely right, and I'm very happy to join him in supporting Think Local, Shop Local in Cornwall. I don't know if I qualify for these brief few seconds as an honorary Cornishman, but if I do, that would be a privilege. But I know he's absolutely right to highlight this. My honourable friend, the member for St Austell and Newquay, and he have highlighted to me how important this sector is to their constituencies and their local economy. So as soon as we safely can, it is right we work to reopen businesses.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Minister for his answers so far. I'm aware that my colleague Diane Dodds, the Northern Ireland Assembly Economy Minister, is attempting to address this very issue and strike the delicate balance between precaution and economic survival. I'm also aware that she has been taking scientific advice from leading scientists on this very issue. Will the Minister commit to sharing his department's scientific evidence with the devolved assemblies to enable us all to have the most up-to-date information to make informed decisions to begin to move forward?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for his question. We have a very close working relationship with the government in Northern Ireland. We will continue to maintain that and to share information as appropriate, as we've done throughout this pandemic, and I pay tribute to the work of the government in Northern Ireland in tackling it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Lancet report that there is 2.6% chance of catching COVID-19 at 1 metre and 1.3% chance of catching it at 2 metres. The World Health Organization recommends 1 metre. It's now time for the government to decide. He knows this will be game-changing for reopening our schools, reopening our economy, but also impeding the spread of this pandemic. He speaks about making the right decision at the right time. 1 metre is the right decision. Now is the right time, not in 2 weeks.
I'm fine.
Well, I am grateful to my honourable and gallant friend again for that question. What the WHO says is that it should be at least 1 metre, so it is not prescriptive in that respect, and I think we should just make sure that we note that. He makes a very powerful case for getting our economy, and particularly getting our small businesses and hospitality businesses moving again. We are making good progress in tackling this disease, but we don't want to put that at risk. The review will give us the scientific evidence to make an informed decision on the way forward.
We go to Scotland with Carol Monaghan. Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And anybody who has seen the crowds waiting for shops to open today, or people in the recent demonstrations, or indeed MPs waiting to queue in Parliament, will know that it's human nature to push the limits. So by having a 2 metre limit or a 2 metre distance, we actually have a margin for error there. So surely by reducing that to 1 metre, people will push that as well and will become even closer. I would urge the government to keep this in place for as long as it's required, knowing what human nature will do.
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable lady, but of course there is both the health impact of the 2 metre social distancing, but also the economic impact, and therefore we must look at this in the round on the basis of both sets of evidence, which is exactly what this review will do.
We now come to Jack Brereton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's fantastic more shops are now reopening in Stoke-on-Trent, and I hope everyone supports our local retailers and market traders. But would my right honourable friend agree it's vital to maintain social distancing and only reduce from 2 metres when the risks are assessed as safe to do so?
Minister.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and it's exactly that this review will be looking at.
22 withdrawn. Gordon Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, caravans and chalets on holiday parks have to be at least 6 metres apart, so residents can easily observe current social distancing guidelines. So would my honourable friend ask the Prime Minister, when undertaking his review, to consider allowing holiday parks to open immediately? Because in doing so, he would be helping to rescue the economy of coastal towns, which are already some of the most deprived communities in the country.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, if I recall, I think my honourable friend has raised this issue previously as well, and he is right to do so, so I'm very happy to give him the assurance he seeks that I will pass his comments on to the Prime Minister.
Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Even if the government were to decide to reduce the limit as a result of this review, it would make very little difference to theatres or to grassroots music venues, because a 1 metre limit or a 2 metre limit won't make much difference. The capacity that they can take in, because they'd have to, just like we would here, still have to keep rows closed, even with a 1 minute limit, half of the theatre closed. So will he make sure that's taken into account in the review and pass that information on to the Chancellor and the Culture Secretary to make sure that support remains even if the 2 metres is reduced to 1 metre for those sectors?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman, Mr. Speaker, and he's quite right. A lot of the debate is focused on hospitality, pubs, restaurants, but he's absolutely right to talk about the impact on music venues, cultural venues and theatres, all of which play a huge part in our national life. I will, of course, highlight that issue to those conducting the review and the Prime Minister and Culture Secretary as he asked me to.
Heading to South Derbyshire with Heather Wheeler. Heather Wheeler.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can my honourable friend confirm that the comprehensive review launched by the Prime Minister into the 2 metre rule will be able to report back to the government as swiftly as possible? This will be very important to pubs and restaurants in South Derbyshire who are chomping at the bit to reopen and welcome customers back.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that question. She emphasises what a number of honourable and right honourable members have quite rightly said, not least my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green, which is about the need for speed and urgency in this review reporting, and I know that that message will have been heard very loud and clear, sir.
Going to Leeds with Richard Bergen. Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Throughout the coronavirus crisis, the government has failed the public. It failed to lock down quickly enough. It failed on PPE. It failed on test, track and trace. Tens of thousands of people have needlessly lost their lives as a result of these failures. The government's chief scientific advisor has previously warned, and I quote, "The risk at 1 metre is about 10 to 30 times higher than the risk at 2 metres. Given that, isn't this push from Tory cabinet members and backbenchers to scrap the 2 metre rule a clear example of putting profit before public safety?"
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have to say it's nice to see the honourable gentleman who shadowed the team I was in when I was a Justice Minister. I have to say, though, it is unsurprising his tone remains the same. What I would say, Mr. Speaker, is that we are doing the right thing at the right time. We are, of course, always seeking to learn lessons, and we are willing to take advice and listen to the scientific and economic advice and evidence. That's what we're doing with this review. Surely he would welcome us taking the appropriate advice and then considering our decisions on the basis of that.
We're going to Harrow with Bob Blackman. Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The current scientific advice says that the risks of transmission are far less in the open air than in enclosed spaces. Clearly, the position now should be that the government needs to look at reducing the social distancing rules when people are in the open air, whilst potentially keeping the advice strong when people are in enclosed spaces. This is clearly important for the hospitality industry, where beer gardens and restaurants with external venues where people can sit outside could restart. But clearly at the moment, with a 2 metre rule in place, they will be unable to. Will my honourable friend look at the scientific evidence to see if we could actually have two sorts of guidance, one for when people are in enclosed spaces and one for when people are in the open air?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight that this is not simply a binary choice about distance. There are many other factors that play a part in this, as other members have alluded to, be it the length of time that one is in close contact with someone, the distance, but also whether it's inside or outside. These are exactly the sort of considerations that those conducting the review under Simon Case will be considering.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we've found out over the past few weeks, consistency of messaging is important, and 2 metres is currently consistent across the UK. All governments in the UK are being questioned on this issue. So can I ask the Minister to ensure that this and any future review involves consultation with the devolved administrations? And can he confirm the mechanism that will be used for this, given that the Scottish Cabinet Secretary for Health expressed concern at last week's Scottish Affairs Committee that ministerial implementation groups have not met for at least 2 weeks?
Minister.
I thank the honourable lady for her question. Throughout this pandemic, we have had a very close working relationship between Edinburgh, Cardiff, London and Belfast, sharing information, regular discussions between ministers and indeed, as I understand it, not just territorial office ministers, but across health and other departments. That will continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Across my constituency of Watford, lots of people are now today going to the Into Centre and many of the shops and using the high street. And one of the things that I'm really hearing from many businesses is that we allow them a certain level of flexibility as we come out of this review. Some shops where they can wear face coverings as customers should be allowed to have 1 metre distancing, and perhaps other areas perhaps should remain at 2. But it should be in a way that helps both customers but also shops and businesses get back to business. Thank you very much.
Well, my honourable friend is right again to highlight the different pieces, in a sense, of this jigsaw that we have in use at the moment, be it distance, be it face covering, be it a whole range of other measures. And I can reassure him that all of those will be considered in the context of this review.
Heading to Scotland, returning with Richard Thompson. Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the evidence shows that the risks of transmission increase between 2 to 10-fold between people decreases from 2 metres to 1 metre, would the Minister agree with me that comparisons internationally with other countries over distance can be misleading, while infection rates in the UK remain higher? And can he further assure the House that in considering the risks involved in any such reduction, commercial and political interests will not be placed ahead of the need to keep the public safe?
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. While I note his point about international comparisons, actually I believe that learning lessons from other countries around the world is something that can be valuable and is something that will be taken into consideration in this review. We should always be willing to look externally to see if there is anything we can learn. And as I've made clear to him and to other members previously, it is important we consider the scientific evidence and ensure that whatever we do keeps pressing down on this virus and protects public health, but at the same time we do not lose sight of the fact that it is important we get our economy up and running again as swiftly and safely as we can.
Gary Sambrook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Businesses across Longbridge, Northfield, Wheelie Castle and Kings Norton have done everything they can to follow the guidance, but they're desperate for the 2 metre rule to be reduced so that they can survive and in many cases actually reopen. And so when the review is finished, will the Minister commit to publishing detailed guidance so that organisations like Northfield Business Improvement District can help keep customers and staff safe and businesses thrive?
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, who is not only a great champion for businesses in his constituency, but indeed across his great city. I hear exactly what he says, and we've been clear that once the review has reported and the Prime Minister has had the opportunity to consider it, I would of course expect the conclusions of that review being made public.
Heading to Scotland with Pete Wishart. Pete Wishart.
And thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the honourable gentleman for his very kind remarks about our honourable friend for Eastern Bartonshire. We're all really rooting for her today. But it would seem that one of the most obvious outcomes in politics is that this review will conclude that 2 metres will become 1 metre, and that this government's cavalier approach to easing the lockdown will continue. And just thank goodness in Scotland we have a caution for Scottish Government. But listening to some of his backbenchers today, you'd almost believe that the health crisis is over and it's simply about reopening the economy. Will he be prepared to stand up to them today and tell them directly that there will be no reopening till the risks are overcome?
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. I wouldn't prejudge what this review will say, and I think it would be wrong to do so, but I equally don't believe that his characterisation of the measured and sensible contributions from honourable and right honourable members on this side of the House is as he portrays it. We have been clear, Mr Speaker, it is important that we do what is right from a public health perspective and we strike the appropriate balance between beating this disease, keeping people safe, but also, where we can safely, allowing businesses to start working again.
Scott Benson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The world-leading packages of support from the Chancellor have provided a lifeline to millions of people and businesses during these difficult times, but these can only go so far. Blackpool South now has the highest unemployment rate in the entire nation, and the dependence of our local economy on the tourism and leisure sectors has left us particularly vulnerable. Local businesses now need a successful summer season if they are going to have any chance of survival at all. And so will my honourable friend commit to supporting these sectors and opening up the economy by relaxing the 2 metre rule when it's safe to do so?
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, Mr Speaker. He is a doughty champion for his constituents in Blackpool. I know that my honourable and right honourable friends, Treasury and Bays ministers, will also heard what he said, but he's absolutely right in his final sentence. We are keen to get his economy locally and the economy around the country going as soon as we can, but when it's safe to do so.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The pub and beer trade in my constituency employs almost 2,000 people, and companies like Fuller, Smith and Turner that are based there say that the difference between the 2 metre or the 1 metre rule is between only 50% of pubs opening to most pubs being able to open. But when he does his review, will he take into account what is happening at some pubs now, which is they're doing takeaways, it's causing long queues, it's as the warm afternoons go on, social distancing is forgotten, people are urinating everywhere on footpaths and public places, and that is also a health hazard, which would be mitigated if more pubs were able to open, and I hope you will consider that.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, the honourable lady makes a very sensible point, as she always does. The review is being conducted under the auspices of the number 10 Permanent Secretary, but with scientists, economists and others feeding into it. I'm sure they will have heard what she said, but I will ensure it's passed on as well.
William Bragg.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'm sorry to be a bit of a killjoy, but whilst we lose ourselves in thoughts of pubs and restaurants reopening, could we perhaps attend to the very minor matter of our national education system and the ability to return children to school? Because the current 2 metre rule makes that impossible. I visited my old primary school, Norbury Hall, in Hazel Grove on Friday to see some of the measures that they're taking. It will be absolutely impossible to return all children to school by September unless this rule is sorted out.
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend who, before his service in this House, if I recall, was a distinguished teacher and served on the Education Select Committee before he ascended to his chairmanship. But he's absolutely right to highlight the impact on schools as well as on businesses. It is one of the things that will, of course, be taken into consideration.
Kate Osborne.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As the government eases lockdown, we still don't have a sufficient test and trace system set up. The R level is increasing above 1 in some regions, and we still have over 1,000 new confirmed cases every day. So can I ask the Minister, should the government be changing crucial social distancing measures knowing this information? What immediate action is being taken in areas that have seen the R rate go above 1 to help get it down? And would lowering it be putting profit before people and the economy before health?
Minister.
Well, firstly, in respect of the R rate, I would caution the Honourable Lady that, on the basis of the SAGE advice, in no region is it above 1. There was 1 out of 10 models done recently, which suggests in 2 regions it might have gone up, but we consider it in the round, not cherry-picking one region, ignoring one study, ignoring the other 9. So it is not above 1. In respect of her point about test and trace, I believe that from setting up a system from scratch, we have done extremely well in the progress we saw reported in the first week and the statistics of the first week of the operation of that scheme. And on her final point, we have made clear throughout this is about following the scientific advice and opening up the economy when it is safe to do so.
We're going to the shadows of Lichfield Cathedral with Vital Fabricants.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say how surprised and delighted I am to hear so many colleagues on both sides of the House who seem to have as their hobby being epidemiologists, and it's great to hear what they have to say. But could I say to my honourable friend, right honourable friend, the Minister, that I'm very reassured by the tone that he's taking in the answers to these questions. He will be aware that in the United States, Sweden, Belgium, and Germany, and now China, there has been a resurgence of COVID-19. And if we were to take any move too soon, nobody would thank us, including businesses, if we have to go back down into lockdown.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and he is absolutely right. It is about conducting this review so we have the best scientific and economic evidence, and so we can make the right decision at the right time when it's safe to do so.
Bentley.
Mr. Speaker, whether the 2-metre rule is maintained or indeed shortened, as the honourable member for Cardiff West mentioned, it will still mean for many businesses that it is unviable to reopen. And given that, would the government consider extending financial support to those businesses who have to remain closed because social distancing measures would make reopening financially unviable?
Yeah. Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. As he will have heard the Chancellor say on many occasions, we continue to keep all measures to support individuals and businesses under constant review, and I know that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, will have heard the point he makes.
We now come to Tim Lawton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I concur with the many honourable and right honourable members who have warned about the implications for the hospitality industry in particular, unless we change these rules sooner rather than later, and the impact particularly on coastal towns. But can I come back to my honourable friend for Hazel Grove? Because is it not the case that there has been greater flexibility for social distancing for pupils in schools, but not for the many adults? And that is partly the problem with why so few children are able to come back. Can we look at this urgently? Otherwise, in September, we will still have many, many children deprived of an education.
Minister.
My right honourable friend, a distinguished former Children's Minister, makes a very good point. It is exactly that sort of thing that I will pass on to ensure the review team do consider in the context of the work they do.
Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister says that this review has to balance economic and health factors, and he's quite right. But the weight of importance for the health factors will be obviously more important for those who are vulnerable or shielding. So will the government be publishing particular advice for people who are in those vulnerable categories? And will he publish some of their health advice so that they can have confidence in the government's overall decision?
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. He is right to highlight that this disease appears at the moment to hit different groups of people with different characteristics differentially, some much harder than others. And one of the reasons we're doing this review is to make sure we look at all that evidence in the round. I don't want to prejudge it, but as he'll know, until this point we've always published a range of guidance and advice at each stage, often tailored to different groups. We will continue to do that where it's appropriate.
41 withdrawn, so we go north of the border with Peter Grant. Peter Grant.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware that what looks like a very, very marginal change in the R number, the infectiousness of the disease, can have serious consequences for public health. With the current 1,000 or so new cases per day, if that number is held at 0.9 over 60 days, those 1,000 people will infect 7,000 other people. If we allow it to creep up to just 1.1, they will infect 25,000 other people. 3.5 times as many people will get the disease. 3.5 times as many people, sadly, will die. So will the Minister commit, when the review is published, to publishing not only the government's assessment as to how the R number will be affected by any changes that they're proposing, but also the government's projections as to how many more people will catch the disease as a result and how many more people will die if the government reduces the 2-metre requirement?
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. The review will consider both economic and particularly clinical and scientific evidence, and as I've said before, once the review is reported and the Prime Minister has had the opportunity to consider it, I would of course expect the conclusions of that review being made public. 43 withdrawn. Emma Lowbell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Our economy is heading for a deep recession. The government was slow to lock down, slow on PPE, slow on testing, tracking and tracing. As a result, we have the second highest death rate in the world. Easing the 2-metre rule will cost more lives. Not easing it will lead to millions unemployed. Either way, the government's negligence means people are going to continue to suffer. The scientific and economic impacts of relaxing this rule are already available. Why is the government running scared of making a decision?
Throughout, the government has taken advice from the best scientists and clinicians we have available, and we have looked around the world as well. This is exactly what this review will do. When this review reports, advisers will have given advice and ministers will decide on the basis of that advice.
Caroline Ansell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 1 in 5 jobs in Eastbourne relies on hospitality, and Hospitality UK estimate that at 2 metres, businesses will operate at an unsustainable, crippling 30% revenue, but at 1 metre, between 60 and 70% and approaching break-even. We must, of course, pursue a safe recovery, as the Minister has outlined. But with the summer season now upon us and opportunities to trade time-sensitive, can my honourable friend assure me that this guidance is being considered with the utmost urgency?
Minister.
I'm happy to give my honourable friend the assurance she seeks that we are very much aware that time matters, and this review is being conducted as swiftly and as rigorously as it can be.
Before it is safe to reduce the 2-metre rule, do we require a world-beating track and trace system to be in place? And does a world-beating track and trace system require a fully functioning app?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his question. As I've set out, I believe we have made an extremely strong and successful start with our track and trace system, and as Baroness Harding, who is heading up that piece of work, has made clear, the app is important, but it is, as she characterised it, the cherry on the cake. It is not essential to have that effective system which we've already got up and running.
Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some hospitality venues in Rushcliffe have told me that even if they're allowed to open, doing so with a 2-metre rule in place will make their business uneconomically viable. Can the Minister reassure the owners of these businesses in my constituency that the government is listening to their concerns and that this reality will be factored in to government policy across the board?
Minister.
The honourable lady's constituency, my honourable friend's constituency, is very near mine. So I suspect that both our constituencies have a similar perspective on that. I'm happy to give her the reassurance she seeks.
David Linden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. If a review is based on genuine, scientific, robust debate, then I've got no problem with that. But does the Minister accept that if the government is going to move from 2 metres to 1 metre, it can't do so the night before the 4th of July and expect consumers to have the public confidence to then go back into bars and things like that as well? So it's fine and well to have the review, but it's got to be good public messaging as well.
Well, the honourable gentleman makes a typically sensible point. It is important that this review is able to be conducted with proper scientific and economic rigour to ensure we have the evidence base we need. I'm not going to prejudge what the decision will be or what that will say, but he is also right to highlight it is important that businesses have as much time as they are able to have to be ready and to prepare for whatever decision may be made.
Final question, James Cartledge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the health arguments, should we not remember that our hospitals have lost capacity in order to operate at 2 metres? And will he assure me that the review will look at how many more beds we could get into hospitals to deal with the elective surgery backlog once they are safe in terms of COVID?
Well, the honourable gentleman makes an important point about getting our NHS back up and running again, not just for emergencies, but for elective procedures and other procedures, which is what we've been doing. The context within a hospital in terms of infection control is slightly different, or is indeed considerably different, to businesses and other contexts. But he's right to highlight the impact that the necessary restrictions are having in a range of contexts on the ability to treat people or to serve people in businesses.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am now suspending the House for 3 minutes.
Order. Order. I call the Home Secretary to make a statement. Priti Patel.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Like all members of this House, I was saddened and sickened at the far-right thugs who came to London this weekend on a so-called mission to protect the statue of Sir Winston Churchill, claiming to want to protect our country's heritage, and yet failing to understand that our country's heritage is founded upon a set of shared values: tolerance, respect for people and property, adherence to the rule of law. And those thugs, far from protecting our heritage, did all that they could to destroy and undermine those values. There is no place for their sickening conduct and hate in our society. They were violent, they were aggressive, and abusive towards police officers. They were patently racist. It is right that a good number have been arrested. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would now like to give the House the latest operational update from the police. In total, over 210,000 people have attended demonstrations across the country following the death of George Floyd. At least 160 protests took place this weekend, with the vast majority passing peacefully. But counter-demonstrations sparked ugly scenes. On Saturday, 2,000 people attended counter-protests in Westminster, with eruptions of violence throughout the day. Racists and far-right hooligans clashed with the police, and fights broke out. Smoke bombs, glass bottles were lobbied at the police in shameful scenes. 38 officers were hurt across the country this weekend as they were kicked, punched, or pelted with missiles. On Saturday alone, there were 137 arrests for offences, including assaults on officers, violent disorder, breaches of the peace, possessions of offensive weapons and Class A drugs, and drunk and disorderly behaviour. In total, at least 100 officers have now been injured, as well as 3 police horses and 1 police dog, and at least 280 arrests have been made. As this ugly operational picture demonstrates, many of the so-called protesters came with the deliberate intent of causing harm to those around them and to police officers. This hooliganism is utterly indefensible. There can be no excuse for pelting police officers with missiles. And of all the dreadful images to emerge from this weekend, the one of a man desecrating the plaque of PC Keith Palmer was the most abhorrent. PC Keith Palmer served our country in so many ways, having first served in our armed forces. He then came to this place and made the ultimate sacrifice during a terror attack at the heart of our democracy. I know that the whole House will join me in sending our thoughts to his family, his colleagues and friends. He will never be forgotten. As I said last week, Mr. Deputy Speaker, when I became Home Secretary, I vowed to stand with the brave men and women of our police, and to stand for law and order, and to stand against the terrorists, the thugs, the criminals who threaten people, towns and communities. A pledge that I'm unapologetic to reiterate once again in this House today. Because sadly, backing our world-class police has never been more important. The scenes of violence and disorder that we have seen in recent weeks have only underlined the challenges that they face. We ask our frontline police officers to do the most difficult of jobs. These courageous men and women run towards danger so that we don't have to. They put their own lives on the line to protect us, to protect the public. They take on the drug dealers, the murderers, and the violent criminals every single day to keep our streets safe. They uphold the rule of law and give us the security and freedom to live our lives as we choose. So I remain saddened at the lack of respect being shown to our brave officers by a small minority of people. And this senseless violence is taking a huge toll on our police. On Friday, I spoke to officers from forces in England and Wales who had been attacked in the line of duty to hear at first hand about their own devastating impact upon them and also upon their loved ones. Their accounts have only strengthened my resolve to step up the support for our police, because an attack on our brave police is an attack on us all. I refuse to allow our outstanding officers to become society's punchbag. And I refuse to allow monuments to heroes who served their country to be vandalised and desecrated. So this government, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is considering all options to stop those who seek to attack these emblems of our national sacrifice and pride, including the proposed desecration of war memorial bills. And I can confirm that my right honourable friend, the Justice Secretary, is meeting with the honourable members for Stoke-on-Trent North and Bracknell this afternoon to take this forward. And my message today is a simple one. Actions have consequences. I want to see these vicious individuals held to account for the violence and the criminality that they perpetrate. I want to see them arrested and brought to justice. Finally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I will turn to the unprecedented national health crisis we find ourselves in. Coronavirus has tragically taken the lives of over 40,000 people in our country. To protect us all and to stop the spread of this deadly disease, any large gatherings of people remain unlawful. So this severe public health risk forces me again to continue to urge the public not to attend future gatherings or protests, If you do so, you are putting your loved ones at risk. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is clear that the far-right thugs who descended on London at the weekend with the intent to cause harm shamed themselves with some abusive and violent conduct. They were violent, they were abusive and aggressive towards the police. They were racist, and there are no excuses for this behaviour. So to the quiet, law-abiding majority who continue to be appalled by this violence and who have continued to live their lives within the rules throughout this pandemic, I completely hear their anger with the scenes that they have seen on our streets. To the police, who continue to be subjected to the most dreadful abuse, you have my full backing as you act proportionately, fairly, and courageously to maintain law and order. And to the criminals, I simply reiterate my earlier remarks. Your behaviour is shameful. No matter who you are, if you have broken the law, you will face justice. I commend this statement to the House.
Nick Thomas Simmons.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the Home Secretary for her statement for advance sight of it. Like everyone in this House, I was appalled by the scenes we saw here in London this weekend. The violence, intimidation and antisocial behaviour were unacceptable, and as I said over the weekend, we condemn these acts absolutely. It was clear that people, including the far right, had come out with the intention of causing violence, coupled with Nazi salutes and missiles hurled at the police. It was despicable to see a man apparently urinating by the memorial dedicated to PC Keith Palmer, a man that defended this very building to keep us members safe. For such a disgusting act to occur next to a monument for a man who gave the ultimate service to his country shows how vile the events of Saturday became. PC Palmer's bravery will never be forgotten. In these terrible scenes, we were reminded once again of the bravery, dedication and professionalism of our front-line police officers, and we owe them a debt of gratitude again. I understand that 23 officers were injured this weekend, and that is, of course, in addition to officers who were injured in previous incidents. I asked the Home Secretary to update us on their well-being, and I have myself been in contact this morning with policing representatives to pass on the thanks of those on these benches. On the issue of the law around war memorials, I recognise the importance that local memorials, including cenotaphs, have, and as it stands, the issue that the law puts the financial value of repair above the hurt such value causes to the community, and I will of course scrutinise the proposal very carefully. On sentencing, bearing in mind some of the media coverage on the weekend, I should point out that the maximum sentence for criminal damage is already 10 years, and sentencing guidelines for damaging memorials would need to be developed considering sentences already handed out for other serious offences. The Prime Minister should also be clear that we will not allow him to move the focus from the action to address the discrimination people face now. And let us be clear, Mr Deputy Speaker, there should be no attempt to draw comparisons between those intent on violence this weekend and the legitimate cause of the Black Lives Matter campaigners who have brought attention to the impact that racism and inequality continue to have both here in the UK and across the world. Now is the time for action. To borrow a phrase from another movement for equality and justice, what's required now are deeds, not words. The Prime Minister's decision to announce yet another review falls woefully short of what is required. Because the Prime Minister could act now. Mr Deputy Speaker, he could implement all the recommendations of the Lamy Review that have been sat there since September 2017. He could bring forward actions on the Wendy Williams Lessons Learned Review now. He could address the fact that just 60 people have been compensated so far in the first year of the Windrush compensation scheme. Just 60 out of 1,000, which is unacceptable. To use the Prime Minister's own words, these plans are oven ready and could be done now. The Prime Minister has the information to act now. The Prime Minister has the recommendations in front of him to act now. The Prime Minister has the power to act now. And isn't the reality that we are in the middle of a powerful national moment
where more delay is not the answer. Isn't the truth, Mr Deputy Speaker, that by failing to act now, the Prime Minister just isn't offering the leadership required?
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Well, I thank the honourable gentleman, of course, as ever, for his comments about police officers policing and also the support that he has given to our injured police officers too. What we have seen over recent weeks has been completely appalling. And Mr Deputy Speaker, there are a number of points that I would like to make in response to the Right Honourable Gentleman's comments and contribution to the House. I think it's important to recognise, I said this in fact this time last week, that peaceful protest of course remains an essential and vital part of our democratic society. And of course Black Lives Matters and the movement itself and the response in terms of the points that they have been making, as we discussed last week on the floor of this House, are absolutely important, essential, vital that we look at the ways in which we can address the issues of inequality and social injustice across our country and society, which is why the Prime Minister has announced a new cross-government commission to effectively champion the voice of BME groups in particular. The new commission on race and ethnic disparities will absolutely look at some of the issues that he has touched on, and I'll come on to the issue of Windrush separately, if I may, Mr Deputy Speaker, in a minute. But these inequalities are live inequalities, which means we need to act now, as the Honourable Gentleman has rightly said. And the aim of the Commission, importantly, is to set out something that is forward-looking and positive, a positive agenda of change, balancing the needs of individuals, community and society, but also maximising opportunities, ensuring fairness for all. And of course that is something that all members in this House should rightly welcome and work collectively together. I said this last week again and I'll keep on saying it. We should unite in our core purpose and objective. We are all leaders and we can absolutely drive this agenda forward. It will, Mr Deputy Speaker, build upon the work of the Race Disparity Unit, and also it will go further in terms of understanding why the disparities exist and what works, what doesn't work, but also build upon recommendations that have already been made to government. Which brings me, Mr Deputy Speaker, onto the point that the Right Honourable Gentleman has made about Windrush, the Wendy Williams review. I have been clear to this House, and I'll say it again on the floor of this House this afternoon, I'll be returning to this chamber to provide a full update in terms of the recommendations and the way in which the Home Office itself, is undergoing much work in terms of a change of culture, looking at itself, looking at the conduct that has taken place historically in the Home Office. These are vital and important issues that have to be addressed. They've not been addressed previously, but also looking at how we will implement the Williams report and look at, there is work taking place right now specifically on compensation and increasing the compensation. He will understand that every single case is a bespoke case. It has to be looked at on an individual basis. These are complicated cases. They cannot just be solved and resolved overnight with payments. We have a team of people working assiduously at looking at every single case. And if the Honourable Gentleman would like an update on the work that is taking place, certainly on the compensation scheme, the outreach work and the programmes that have been undertaken and are still forthcoming right now, with our online stakeholder teams, I'd be very, very happy to update him on that work.
Virtual presence, Nikki Aiken.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. For the past 2 weekends, parts of my constituency of the cities of London and Westminster have experienced some appalling acts of criminal damage, including smashed windows and offensive graffiti, and even worse, violence towards frontline police officers. Would my right honourable friend agree that we should recognise the outstanding service these brave officers have given to ensure the safety of both peaceful protesters and local residents whose lives are frequently disrupted by such protests? And will she commit to bringing to justice those hooligans responsible and reassure all those on the front line that they have this government's complete support?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I thank her for her question. As the Member of Parliament for the constituency that was affected by Quite shocking scenes, I think it's fair to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, which we've already touched on in my statement and in opening remarks. I think there are a number of points to make here right now. The police have been absolutely incredible, and I pay tribute to the Metropolitan Police, all the officers and in fact their operational command over the weekend. I have been in constant contact with the Metropolitan Police Commissioner throughout the weekend, and many of the teams I've seen myself, and I've been in touch with the Commissioner again this morning. My honourable friend is absolutely right to pay tribute to all the officers that served to keep her constituents safe at the weekend, but also to man the protests and, quite frankly, arrest the individuals that were perpetrating violence and crime. And in answer to her final point about ensuring that the perpetrators of the violence, the thuggery, the hooliganism face justice, absolutely, we will support the police in all their efforts to bring forward the investigations, use police body cam footage, CCTV footage, and make sure those individuals that they absolutely face justice.
Virtual presence, Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I thank the Home Secretary for her advance sight of her statement. I'm on the record as a vigorous defender of free speech and the right to peaceful assembly, but the violent and racist behaviour we saw at the weekend was totally unacceptable, and the desecration of PC Palmer's memorial was appalling, and I'd like to commend the police for their bravery and for their restraint. We're still in the middle of a public health crisis, and people should not be taking part in mass gatherings because it's not safe. It puts health at risk and potentially puts life at risk, given the threat we're all still facing from the virus. That said, it's really important that we don't let this reprehensible public disorder and the debate about statues distract us from the most important issue, which is the inequalities suffered by Black and minority ethnic people in modern Britain. We were starkly reminded of these at the weekend when the 3rd anniversary of the Grenfell fire passed with still no justice for the victims, and when Channel 4 News revealed the government's suppression of reporting about the true extent of the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black and minority ethnic communities. The Prime Minister has announced yet another review, but what we need is not another review, but action on the recommendations of the many other reviews which have already reported. Now, I would have thought that a review such as that announced by the Prime Minister is the Home Secretary's remit. So why is the Prime Minister announcing public policy from behind a paywall in the Daily Telegraph rather than coming to the floor of the House? When will this House get to debate the terms of the review and the way in which it is to be conducted? What's stopping the government from implementing the recommendations of the Windrush Lessons Learned Review without further delay? And when will the findings of the full findings of the Public Health England report be put into the public domain? And will the government implement the recommendations of Professor Kevin Fenton? And finally, what's stopping the Home Secretary from getting rid of policies like no recourse to public funds, which we know impact adversely and disproportionately on Black and minority ethnic children?
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. As I have already stated and said to the House already, the Prime Minister rightly has announced that he is establishing a new cross-government commission, and that will, again, rightly so, Mr Deputy Speaker, build upon many of the recommendations and the work that has taken place, in addition to the previous work of the Race Disparity Unit. I think everybody in the House should welcome that. This is a constructive and positive move forward, and again, this will be led by, along with the review into the public health measures that the Right Honourable Lady refers to around COVID-19 by the Equalities Minister in the Equalities Department. The Honourable Lady mentions the delay to Windrush recommendations. There is no delay at all. I spelt out when I gave the report here on the floor of the House the time frame that I would be reporting back to this House of Commons. I'm sticking to that timetable, and I'll be here on the floor of the House before we break for summer recess to outline not just the recommendations of the Windrush Lessons Learned review, but also to expand upon some of the potential policy changes and a review of many of the practices within the Home Office itself.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Those that seek to destroy public order are trying to divide us, when in fact the British public speak as one. We stand against racism, we stand against violence and vandalism conducted by whomever and for whatever reason, and we support our police. Does my right honourable friend agree that those individuals seeking to violently foster this division deserve to face the full force of the law?
Well, of course, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and Mr Deputy Speaker, I think it's a really poignant and important moment to recognise as well that notwithstanding the intolerance that we have seen on the streets of London, our capital, over the weekend, we are all one nation. And we are all one community. We can celebrate our differences, but at this time in particular, we should be coming together to work together to address many of the issues that are being raised. There's no doubt about that. And he, of course, is right, and he will know from his time as a police special as well, the vital work that our police have been doing. I commend them, I praise them all. And as I said in my statement, they are the ones that run towards danger to keep us all safe.
Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I join with the tributes to police force and police officers and also to PC Keith Palmer. The Home Secretary will be aware of the involvement of far-right extremist groups in organising this weekend's appalling violence and vile attacks on the police. And including people who were giving Nazi salutes and also people who've been involved in promoting vile racism on and offline and extremism too. The government's independent advisor on countering extremism recommended that the Home Secretary chair a new task force on countering hateful extremism. Can I ask her, has she set up that task force and what action is it taking?
Well, the Right Honourable Lady is absolutely right in terms of the people that we saw on the streets, their abhorrent behaviour, but specifically in terms of the task force that she has mentioned, there is work taking place now on that task force and has been for some time within the department itself. I'll happily write to her and share the details of that.
Virtual presence, Kate Griffiths.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My friend John, the hard-working neighbourhood police who were on hand at recent Black Lives Matter protests in my constituency in Uttoxeter in order to make sure those present social distance guidelines. What additional support the government is providing?
Kate, I'm terribly sorry, I can't hear you. I suspect the Home Secretary can't either. We'll try and come back to you when that can be resolved. We'll go now to Christine Jardine.
Much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I echo the remarks that have been made paying tribute to the work done by the police force in the face of such horrific, mindless violence and acts at the weekend. But can I draw the Home Secretary's attention to the fact that many of us are concerned by the fact that this review, which the Prime Minister has announced, we've yet to see the details of it, and threatens to be a distraction from the real problem at the moment, which is that so many of our BAME communities in this country feel that they are the disproportionate victims of stop and search and many other inequalities. That we have to address them, we have to act now, and we cannot allow this to be a distraction. And yet another review which sits on a Whitehall shelf, paying lip service to action rather than actually providing the action that we need.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I think it's important for me to reiterate, I touched on this in my statement last week in the House, but specifically to the review, the commission that is being established by my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister. It is the right approach, because we are at this pivotal moment now where if we are serious, not just about building upon past reviews, looking at previous data, and rightly so, we should, and previous policies. Many government policies are under review anyway. Look at COVID, where we've demonstrated that. But to combat the real inequalities in our society, and in fact, Mr Deputy Speaker, to end many of the gross disservices to many of the communities across the nation when we see inequalities, lack of access to social justice, press inequalities, we must find a way to address these sensitive and difficult issues in an accurate and in a responsible way by addressing the root causes of them. And that is exactly the objective of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, which is why he's taken this course of action.
Imran Ahmed Khan.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Over the last few weeks, we have sadly witnessed vile attacks perpetrated by violent extremists of all stripes on our streets. Further, the Home Secretary and I, along with other Conservative colleagues, have been subject to torrents of hateful prejudice and, frankly, racist abuse from the left's legions outside, as well as in the case of my right honourable friend, sadly from sources on the benches opposite, as we refuse to conform to their prejudices. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that the Leader of the Opposition should condemn all these attacks and support the full weight of the law being applied equally to everyone, no matter how righteous they believe their views are?
I thank my honourable friend for his comments. He is absolutely right. He's absolutely right. We should be calling out collectively racist and intolerant behaviour. And I'm saddened, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the Leader of the Opposition has effectively failed to depart from the divisive, hateful, racist politics of its former leader. And as for that letter, I will not be dignifying that letter with a response at all.
Jane Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Our police have shown tremendous restraint and admirable calm in the last 2 weeks when faced with dangerous attacks and being subject to crowds with COVID-19 still very much a factor. Will the Secretary of State make sure that anyone attacking our police will face the full force of the law, and those attacking service animals will be prosecuted as quickly as possible under Finn's law?
My old friend is absolutely right, and she speaks with great passion, and also for her constituents as well in her response, and highlighting the abhorrent and appalling attacks that have been subject to our police officers, and also to police animals as well. First of all, they should all feel the full force of the law. There is no doubt about that. But also, I think we should just recognise that assaults on police officers have an intolerable impact upon them as individuals. They are human beings. They are people too. They have family members and loved ones who worry about them when they leave home to go to work. And that is why, Mr Deputy Speaker, as I've said previously, later on this year we will be bringing in legislation on protecting our police and the police covenant to make sure that they have their rights upheld in statute.
Mary Kelly-Foy.
Mr Deputy Speaker, this weekend we saw neo-fascists and the far right marching on the streets of Britain. Now, more than ever, we need a government and a Home Office that can be trusted to tackle the racism and prejudice that still exists in British society. Yet the Lessons Learned report on Windrush found that the Home Office displayed ignorance and thoughtlessness on issues of race, whilst the majority of the victims of that policy are still without compensation. Given this, can the Home Secretary tell me how people can be expected to trust the Home Office to adequately address racism in British society?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I recall when I came here, I actually called out the Home Office to quote, the institutional ignorance and thoughtlessness that was found and identified in the Wendy Williams Lesson Learned review. I've read that entire review and I hope she has, the Honourable Lady has as well. With response to dealing with racism, I think the fact that I have made it my personal commitment to work with Wendy Williams, to bring in many of the recommendations, and I will come to the floor of the House, as I've said several times already, to talk further about that. But also when it comes to compensation, I'm sure the Honourable Lady has already heard what I've had to say. Every single case is treated in the right way, individually. These are all individuals who have suffered themselves a great deal of suffering through dreadful treatment, yes, by the Home Office, but also by successive governments. So I think it's important that everybody in this House recognises that when it comes to compensation, every single person is a victim and every single person deserves the right kind of treatment and commitment and support so that they receive the right level of compensation.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome the approach that the Home Secretary has outlined during recent days and the robust approach she has taken, and also for speaking with me on Friday ahead of the protest march that took place in Cleethorpes. Thankfully, that passed off without a severe incident. But nevertheless, as she pointed out in her statement, the very fact that these marches are taking place at a time when social distancing rules are still in place causes unnecessary anxiety, particularly to the elderly and vulnerable. Will she give an assurance that she'll continue to work with the police and local authorities and others to ensure that those protest marches are deterred and actually don't take place?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question and the way in which he's been addressing this issue locally as well, as a local leader and a figurehead in his own community and constituency. It is important, incumbent, Mr Deputy Speaker, upon us all that we continue to make this case. We are in the midst of a public health emergency right now. People's lives are at risk by mass gatherings and also by participating in protests. And it is right that every agency, the police and crime commissioners, MPs, the NHS locally, local authorities come together to continually restate that and reiterate that message. And I commend my honourable friend for the work that he's doing locally.
Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I first thank the Home Secretary for unequivocally condemning the far-right fuggery that we witnessed in the abhorrent behaviour on our streets, and also pay tribute to the police officers and wish the best speedy recovery for those who were injured. Mr Deputy Speaker, today the Prime Minister has announced another review. We've had the race disparity audit in 2017, we've had the Lammy review, we've had the McGregor-Smith review, we've had the Lessons Learned review, we've had the COVID-19 Public Health England review, for which we still don't have the details, which are being hidden by this government. This covers health, it covers education, it covers inequality in employment, injustice that are faced by BAME communities. Why do we need another review for things that we have known for over decades, and not just getting on and doing the actions that need to address it?
Well, I'm saddened by the Honourable Lady's tone, and I thought she would welcome an attempt to combat the real inequalities in our society, to end what has been a great disservice to many communities across our nation who are subject to real and pressing inequalities. I think it is right that we should all come together in a measured, responsible, reasonable way and to work together. I'm just sorry that the Honourable Lady is not of that persuasion.
Neil O'Brien.
Mr Deputy Speaker, there was widespread revulsion in my constituency the other day when the news emerged that somebody had defecated on a war memorial in Market Harborough. So I strongly welcome my honourable friend's commitment to introduce new legislation to protect such memorials. Mr Deputy Speaker, while my constituents are doing everything they can to fight this deadly violence, they see on TV far-right thugs coming here to urinate on the memorial to a fallen police officer. They don't speak for the people of this country. Yeah. The weekend before that, they saw hooligans disrupting the Black Lives Matter protests, those important protests, by injuring dozens of police officers. They don't speak for Black Lives Matter, and they don't speak for this country either. Does my right honourable friend agree that the people who really represent this country are our brave police officers who are putting themselves in the line of danger to protect innocent people? Will she do everything she can to back them to the hilt, accelerate the work on the police covenant, and make sure that the hooligans who injure our police officers end up where they belong, in jail?
My friend is absolutely right, and I just want to thank him for the passion which he has shown in the way in which he's made his remarks this afternoon in the House. He is right on every single level. I pay tribute to our police, our public service personnel as well, who were supporting the police over the weekend, who worked so they were flat out, selflessly trying to protect the public from those thugs, from the hooligans who were perpetrating the most appalling scenes of criminality, violence, disorder, and the most aggressive and revolting behaviour that we saw. First of all, racism and thuggery and that kind of hooliganism should never ever be tolerated at all. And my honourable friend is absolutely right. He speaks for the nation when he says that those individuals should face the full force of the law, and that's effectively what will happen to them.
Kate Green.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Home Secretary will be aware of the illegal rave that took place at Carrington in my constituency on Saturday, at which 3 people were stabbed and 1 seriously wounded. A woman was raped, and the police reportedly came under attack from the crowd. Is she confident that the police have the powers and the resources to act on intelligence received to prevent these illegal events happening as we go into the summer, and what steps will she take to assure the police that they will have her support in taking all necessary action to bring those who organise such events to justice.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her comments and the points that she has made. First of all, our police have been under unprecedented strain and pressure, as we have all seen, and as I said in my statement. I'd like to pay tribute to her police force, actually, and to her Chief Constable Ian Hopkins, who, quite frankly, has been incredible throughout the whole COVID period. And with regards to that disgusting event that took place at the weekend, totally disgraceful. Again, through police intelligence and planning and preparing, obviously the police were then able to go in the right kind of way to break it up but take the necessary course of action. But she asked an important question, which is about intelligence, the type of intelligence that is out there to identify illegal gatherings, mass gatherings, protests, and basically events that will lead to public disorder and hostility. Our police are working flat out, and that is exactly how they were able to map through an intelligence picture this weekend the type of activities that were taking place, and operationally plan for police numbers, the type of policing, the tactics, and the command operations that were put on standby, basically, and then enacted. But I think it's important that we constantly stay in touch with the police. I speak to them every single day. All members of the House are aware of that. And it's important that we use that information and intelligence to make sure that they are protected, they are prepared, they're resourced and equipped to actually do the right thing to protect the public.
Gagan Mahindra.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I join with the tributes to our frontline police? As the House will be aware, we are currently going through the biggest public health crisis in a century. It has killed over 40,000 people, especially those within the BAME community in this country, and it will sadly take more. Does my right honourable friend agree or believe that anyone attending large public gatherings, especially when not following distancing advice, is putting not only themselves at risk, but also the lives of their families, friends and communities?
My friend is absolutely right, and as I have said, I've said it at the weekend and many times again, and I would urge everyone to do this within their own communities. We are in a public health pandemic, and we are not out of the woods when it comes to this horrendous disease. We've made such tremendous progress, and we're all grateful for that, and the British public have shown tremendous resolve and resilience throughout this entire pandemic. But it is right that we continue to reinforce that message. Mass gatherings, 6 or more people, are illegal. People should not be participating in them. And also when it comes to policing, the strain that puts our police officers under has been seen this weekend. Whether it's in London, Glasgow, Leeds or Manchester, that is simply not right. We have to do more collectively to make sure that we can stop the spread of the virus, but also protect our police.
Virtual presence, Martin Day.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I think we can all unite in condemning the violent actions that were seen at the weekend, totally deplorable. However, we mustn't allow those actions to detract from the genuine concerns of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'm beginning to lose count of the number of reports and reviews that I've seen in the 5 years that I've been in Parliament. So I want to know what the Prime Minister's cross-departmental review will achieve that the others haven't. And what can the Home Secretary say to allay my fears that it's just a populist exercise to look busy rather than actually change anything?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm disappointed with the tone of the Honourable Gentleman's question. I'll refer him to what I've said already. But the purpose of this review and also the work of this government is to drive actions and outcomes and to address many of the core issues that honourable members in this House across both sides have been raising. These are legitimate issues that we should all collectively be working together to address. And that's what this government and this Prime Minister will be doing.
Julian Lewis.
Will the Home Secretary join with me in praising the action of Patrick Hutchinson, who rescued a white demonstrator from the other side of the riot, as it were, because he didn't wish him to be injured and thus discredit the Black Lives Matter movement? And will she also endorse with me what I think I heard the Honourable and Learned Lady for Edinburgh South West say, which is that trying to impose the values of the modern era on people and personalities from a past age is rather irrelevant compared with trying to make sure that we examine the way in which people behave towards the black community today.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and in reference to the gentleman that he was referring to in his remarks, I think, Mr Deputy Speaker, all members of the House will join me in saying that he's the very best of Britain. Our country needs more people like him, and his actions this weekend spoke volumes. I pay tribute to him and the way in which he conducted himself, the way in which he stepped in. And in response to my honourable friend's point about coming together and statues, we learn from our past so that we can have a more stronger, resilient and secure future, and that's absolutely right.
Try and go back to Kate Griffiths. Kate Griffiths.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Will my right honourable friend join me in thanking the hard-working neighbourhood policing teams from Staffordshire Police, who were on hand at recent Black Lives Matter protests in my constituency of Burton and Uttoxeter in order to make sure those present adhered to social distancing guidelines. Can she confirm what additional support the government is providing to the police as they meet the challenges of policing during this pandemic?
I thank my honourable friend for her question, and of course I wholeheartedly commend her neighbourhood policing teams for the incredible work that they are doing and have been doing for over 12 weeks now in response to the COVID health emergency, engaging the community and encouraging people, of course, to stay at home to control the spread of the virus. But she asked an important question about resourcing. And of course, not just now, but we are doing this consistently and throughout this government. We are increasing the number of police officers that we have, so she will be aware that in her own area of Staffordshire, she will be receiving 90 more police officers, and of course her police force has had a cash increase of approximately £14 million. That's money that goes to the front line, that's money that goes to protecting our communities and keeping people safe, but that's money, a real investment in our police officers, which is exactly what they have been calling for a considerable period of time.
Virtual presence, Afzal Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I start by saying that I am disappointed to hear the Home Secretary's lack of clarity on when exactly she intends to update the House on the implementation of the Wendy Williams review into the Windrush scandal. People have died waiting and many more are suffering. However, I do share her disgust at far-right activity which took place over the weekend. I have personally received racist and Islamophobic emails from far-right racists over the past few months. Can she outline what steps are being taken by her department to tackle far-right activity both online and offline?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I refer the honourable gentleman to my comments earlier on Windrush, and he will have to wait patiently, but also I think there is a need for members to recognise the way in which casework for Windrush compensation schemes are undertaken. These are complicated cases, and he'd be very welcome to come into the department to learn more about the actual work that we are doing on that. And I'd invite all other colleagues that would like to come in to see the work of our Windrush team. When it comes to the type of thuggery, racism, abuse that the honourable gentleman refers to, there is a great deal of work that's taking place, not just in the Home Office, but across government. And that is because, as I've already said in my statement and several times in response to questions, we're a tolerant country and a tolerant society, and there is no place for any of that activity, racism, intolerance or hatred.
Virtual presence, Luke Evans.
Thank you to Deputy Speaker. And can I associate myself with the comments both of the Secretary of State and Shadow Secretary of State regarding peaceful protests and the police? Since the tragic death of George Floyd in the US, we've heard lots of personal testimonies and experiences in the media, the public, and indeed even in this House about racism in the UK. So how does my right honourable friend respond to the accusations from some on the benches opposite about her gaslighting when she shares her own personal experiences of racism?
I thank my honourable friend for his comments, and as I've already said, I'm not even going to dignify that pathetic letter with a response. And I think it's fair to say, Mr. Speaker, that sadly too many people are just willing to casually dismiss the contribution of others from different ethnic minority backgrounds who do not necessarily confront or conform to their preconceived ideas or views or stereotype or expectation of how ethnic minorities should think. This in itself is racist. As I said last week, and as I've said every single day, I will not be silenced by those that choose and want to continue to silence me. And it is right that in order to combat the real inequalities in our society, that we all come together. This isn't about point scoring and behaving in really quite a dreadful and insensitive and racist and intolerant way. We owe it to many groups across our country and across society to come together to find solutions to the actual inequalities that they face.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. As the Home Secretary has quite rightly pointed out, there's been a prohibition on gatherings of more than 6 people since the 1st of June. What discussions has she had with police forces about the enforceability of those rules, and how many people have been issued with a fine for breaking that rule?
So I speak to police officers every single day, so the police leadership, the MPCC, and we do have the figures. I don't have the figures with me in terms of the number of fixed penalty notices that have been issued. I'd be more than happy to get to him the latest figures that we have and write to him.
Mr. Buchan.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the police in Kensington for their effective and sensitive policing over the course of the last few weeks. The Mayor of London has effectively closed one of my 2 main police stations, Notting Hill, by closing the front counter. Now that we as a government are putting more money into policing, does my right honourable friend agree with me that the Mayor should reconsider his decisions on London police stations?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for her comments, particularly about the very respectful way in which aspects of her own constituency have been policed, particularly over the weekend in terms of the commemorations around Grenfell that took place. When it comes to policing in London, obviously the Mayor of London acts as a police and crime commissioner. I think it's disappointing that he has chosen not to invest in policing, support policing, back the police in the way in which this party has been doing so in government. And my message really is very simple. Londoners have a great opportunity next year in particular to vote for a candidate, a Conservative candidate, who will put law and order at the heart of his agenda and back the police, particularly in London, 100%.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Winston Churchill uncompromisingly fought the Nazi terror. That legacy is recognised the world over, and the British people are rightly proud of that. Nazi salutes near the statue of Winston Churchill are a travesty of what he stood for and what he fought against. Does she agree with me that we all have to be much more vigilant and much more uncompromising about the rising threat of right-wing nationalist extremism in our midst?
The Honourable Lady is absolutely right.
Joy Morrissey.
100 police officers injured is unacceptable, and I thank my right honourable friend for your boldness and courage in speaking out against these attacks on police officers. Will my right honourable friend consider reviewing the Section 35 ASB so that police officers can check and verify the names and addresses of violent protesters, so that these protesters will not exploit the loopholes in the law that are allowing them to avoid justice and prison sentences?
Of course, my friend raises a very important point in terms of policing and arrest. They absolutely have the powers that they need. This is a point that has been raised already. It is important, though, once they're arrested, that they go through the right process, and that also means the right processes through the criminal justice system. Myself and my right honourable friend, the Lord Chancellor, will always look to do everything we can to protect the police through police powers and protection, but I think fundamentally make sure that the thugs involved absolutely face the full force of the law.
Virtual presence, Marianne Fellows.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister has announced yet another review in the Telegraph today And the Secretary of State has vigorously defended this and tries to reassure members and right honourable members that this will be the answer. Doesn't she understand that people want to know they're being listened to and that swift action is going to be taken to address racism in this country? How can the Secretary of State reassure people that there will be meaningful action from this government?
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. In answer to the Honourable Lady's question, there are some important points here. We cannot prejudge what communities think or what their experiences are. And it is right that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has commissioned the review that he has to build upon, yes, previous lessons and data that we have in government, but importantly to engage the communities that are impacted. I'm saddened that the Honourable Lady is shaking her head because as I've said earlier on in the House, and I will restate again, Mr Deputy Speaker, it is important that everybody learns lessons. It is important that we respect all communities. It is important that we show tolerance and understanding to all communities, and that's exactly what the Prime Minister will be doing through this new commission.
Mr McCartney.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My constituents who have been doing the right thing and making huge sacrifices to restrict the spread of the virus have been watching the events in London over the past 2 weekends with a mixture of disbelief and anger, and I join them in demanding that the Mayor of London gets a grip. And if he won't, will my right honourable friend step in and get a grip?
Mr Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. The British public have made enormous sacrifices throughout the COVID crisis. And it is right, as I've said already, that the sacrifices that they have made and the hard-won gains we've made as a country in tackling coronavirus are not lost through these gatherings. It is right, and I too would urge the Mayor of London, as I have been, as have the police, the Met Commissioner as well, to stand firm and discourage these gatherings. And quite frankly, if the Mayor of London isn't prepared to do that, then we will absolutely do that and fill that void.
Virtual presence, James Murray.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. We know this government has failed to implement the recommendations from the Lammy Review and the Windrush Lessons Learned Review, and it chose to hide recommendations from Public Health England's review into the impact of COVID-19 on BAME communities. So can the Home Secretary explain why anyone should draw any confidence from the Prime Minister's cross-governmental commission in response to the Black Lives Matter protests?
Well, the answer is very simple. We're the ones getting on doing the job, and I completely disagree with the Honourable Gentleman's comments.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I join the Home Secretary in paying tribute to our amazing police officers, their courage, their bravery in keeping us all safe. With regards to the far-right activity, does the Secretary of State agree with the words of the head of the Metropolitan Police Anti-Terror Unit, who says that the far right is the fastest growing terrorist threat facing our country? And if the Home Secretary agrees with that, what specific steps are we taking to challenge that threat?
My friend is absolutely right on the issue of far right-wing terror. This has evolved in recent years. That is a complete fact, and we have seen all sorts of terror attacks in the UK carried out specifically by lone actors associated with this dreadful and hateful, corrosive ideology. There are varying activities taking place, much of which is being worked upon, obviously, through agencies that work with the Home Office. Significant investments have been put in place by the Home Office, but also with our agencies. And I think, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd be more than happy to provide further details to my right honourable friend, because this is a growing trend. And on that basis, that is exactly why we've been investing very heavily in this area.
Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
I congratulate the Home Secretary on not only the tone, but actually the content of much of what she has said. And I hope that in protecting war memorials, it won't just be war memorials, but all memorials that are culturally sensitive and significant. And it focuses on community payback, not just putting people in prisons. In Brighton, we had 10 to 20,000 people march on the Black Lives Matters. Most were very good, socially distanced, almost all wore masks. And at the same time, we had a number of far-right extremist thugs standing on our memorial too, doing Nazi salutes, drinking alcohol and getting drunk, just like we saw here. We mustn't just dismiss these people, however, just as thugs, because we know that they are organised, They have killed before, including friends of my personal friends, not only here in Britain, but in Norway as well, that I knew. So can I ask the Secretary of State what she is doing to coordinate with international colleagues to ensure that their communications and ideology of these people are disrupted?
No, the Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right in the way in which he has outlined and highlighted this just appalling issue. There is a great deal of work taking place internationally, mainly through our intelligence organisations and agencies, through the shared work that they're doing. I, in fact, had my last briefing on Thursday last week in terms of some of the organisations, some of the groups, some of the ways in which they connect, share information, activity, open source, as well as on the dark web. As I've already highlighted, Mr Deputy Speaker, as I've said to my right honourable friend earlier, I'm more than happy to provide further information about the work that has taken place. This is a serious and growing threat. We have lone actors operating around the world on virtual networks, and there is a great deal of work that's taken place that we can be proud of, but at the same time we have to be vigilant. We have to be vigilant to protect our people, our country, but also to prevent some terrible atrocity from taking place.
Virtual presence, Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Scout movement across the country and in Harlow has transformed the lives of thousands of children, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds, and I've seen this myself in my own constituency. Does my right honourable friend not agree that the removal of the statue of its founder, of the Scouts founder, would not only be a threat to public order, but damages the reputation of the incredible Scout movement? And does she not agree that if statues are going to be moved, there should be a proper national conversation, a local conversation, and democratic consent so that people can understand properly the true history of these individuals? And we should not forget the important work that the Scout movement have done in the past and will do in the future.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right and correct in his comments. The Scouts are a fantastic organisation. They are heroic around the country in terms of the work that they do across all our constituencies, in fact, at the grassroots. They help to transform lives in terms of skills of young people and also providing opportunities. But he hits the nail on the head when it comes to the most salient point, which is that we live in an open, free, tolerant society with democratic processes. And it's those democratic processes that should be followed when it comes to statues, discussions about statues, either coming down or even going up, Mr Deputy Speaker. And it is right that we follow those processes, we engage our local communities, we engage our stakeholders, work with those processes and our local councils to make sure that that happens. And I'm delighted that my right honourable friend has made that point.
Virtual presence, Kirsten Oswald.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I agree with the way the Secretary of State has characterised the racist demonstrators at the weekend. And I see that the Prime Minister has now announced another review via the pages of the Telegraph. I've listened carefully to what the Secretary of State has said today, but I'm still not clear what is stopping the implementation of the recommendations from reviews which have already taken place.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Well, as I've said earlier on, Mr Deputy Speaker, the aim of the Commission is to set out a new positive agenda for change, which means looking at the needs of the individuals, communities and society, but also looking at opportunities. But it will also build upon previous work that has taken place, including the work of the Race Disparity Unit. But it wants to go further than just looking at that work. It wants to find solutions, present recommendations, but importantly actions, both for government and for public bodies.
Mark Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Our nation's capital has been shamed by the scenes that we have seen over the past 2 weekends. Yet so many of my constituents stay at home and follow the government's advice. Does my right honourable friend agree that actually those scenes do not represent the best of Britain? The best of Britain are the people who continue to be law-abiding and who stand with our police who protect our great nation.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I thank him for the passionate way in which he spoke this afternoon. I pay tribute to our police, obviously, but importantly, the sacrifices that people have made throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, recognising, of course, that it is the silent, law-abiding majority of our great country, our great nation, who, like us all in this House, watched those scenes at the weekend with complete horror. We stand with the people that live by the rule of law, stand up for justice and order, and completely call out the scenes and the atrocities that we saw at the weekend.
Jim Farron.
Thanks, Mr Deputy Speaker. Cumbria's police report that since the lockdown, on 27 separate occasions, officers have been spat at. Now, each weekend we see that police and rangers report a minority of visitors abusing them and locals and guilty of littering, vandalism and complete disregard for the welfare of wildlife and of livestock. And whilst it goes without saying that most visitors behave absolutely impeccably, will the Home Secretary fund and enforce a new promotion of the Countryside Code so that everyone respects local communities and protects our environment?
Well, I think the Honourable Gentleman is right to point out that it is a small minority that cause the most harm, basically, where the law-abiding play by the rules, live by the rules and conduct themselves in the right way. I think it's important to say also, Mr Deputy Speaker, in beautiful parts of the country, and there are many, including his own constituency, there's much more work that can be done, not just with the police, but with local authorities and local agencies to ensure that the awareness campaigns, and the police have been doing this, we are supporting the Home Office, we've been working with the police to absolutely communicate those messages. But we need those messages reinforced by many of those other agencies in his communities and across the country.
Bristow.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I share the alarm at the actions of the far right this weekend, and I commend the police officers on their bravery and their courage. In the preceding days and weeks, senior police officers have made tactical decisions not to uphold the law. Does my right honourable friend agree that those kind of tactics, while well-intentioned, signalled weakness and should not reoccur?
Well, I think it's important to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, that when it comes to policing, all policing decisions are based on their operational independence and at the same time recognising the situation around every single event. We must all recognise that. That is not for us to make a judgment over from this side, in Parliament in particular. I speak to policing leaders every day, as honourable members know, and I've seen and heard of all sorts of scenarios that the police have been confronted by over the last 2 weeks. But what I would say, it is the right thing and the right approach that we back our police. But obviously, where there are challenges in policing, where there are tactical issues or issues with operational command, it is right that we raise that directly with the police. And it's right that we do that with our police and crime commissioners as well, who obviously have responsibility for the way in which their forces operate and much of the policing that takes place within their force areas.
Alex Norris.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. During the coronavirus, already sky-high levels of violence and abuse against shop workers has doubled. As non-essential retail opened today, we've all seen the pictures, and this will be a key public audit issue for our police to manage. And many of the answers to this lie in the government's call for evidence that they've now sat on for nearly a year. In the interests of public order, will the Home Secretary commit to publish this as soon as possible?
Well, I'd be more than happy to look at that and follow up on the point that the Honourable Gentleman has made. I think, Mr Speaker, if I may, the Honourable Gentleman has made an important point today as retail across our country reopens. We have seen over the last 12 weeks some of the most appalling assaults on our shop workers. Only yesterday I saw the most appalling footage from the Ealing Road in Wembley of an assault on an independent retailer. This is simply unacceptable, and it's right that obviously we all support the police, and the police are the right thing in terms of investigating these abhorrent crimes. But I would say that there's more that we can do coming together on this. I have to say I've seen over years and years, and he will know as well, just the most appalling and abhorrent abuses of our retail sector and our shop workers, and this is another area where we must do much more work.
Mr Drummond.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree, in our country we do not turn to criminal damage and mob rule to enact change or erase our past, but through well-tested and effective democratic channels?
Well, my friend is absolutely right. We are blessed. We live in an open, free, tolerant and democratic society and country. I think we are one of the greatest countries in the world. And we have these processes, we have these levers, and it's right that we all use them for whatever cause we support, but to drive the right outcomes and to drive justice.
Kate Osborne.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Public Health England's review on COVID-19 on BAME communities showed what we already knew. The BAME communities are disproportionately affected by this virus. But can the Home Secretary outline why the government chose to hide the missing recommendations from the Public Health England review? And will the government now reveal those missing recommendations?
I'd say to the Honourable Lady, as I said in fact last week when I was here on the floor of the House, the Equalities Minister, rightly so, has taken charge of this review. The recommendations, findings and details will be published, and I'm sure she, along with all honourable members, will not only look forward to that, but actually work with the government to be constructive. This is a matter for the Equalities Minister, and I'm sure we'll be very happy to come back with further details if we can on this.
Bobby Moore.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for her statement. Many residents of mine across Keighley and Ilkley were quite rightly outraged by this weekend's violence targeted towards our police, in which can only be described as thuggery carried out by ignorant fools. Will my right honourable friend commit to bringing these hooligans responsible for assaulting our police officers to justice? And can she assure me that our officers have the full government's support?
I thank my friend for his question, and he's absolutely right in terms of applying the full force of law to those thugs and hooligans that were on our streets this weekend, but also in terms of the support that this government has given to our police officers. He will know in West Yorkshire alone they'll be receiving the force 256 more police officers, an uplift in terms of cash of approximately £36 million. That is transformational in terms of policing, and again illustrates our commitment to back the police.
Lawrence Eshalami.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I just wanted to commend the Home Secretary on condemning the actions of the very small minority of people intent on causing problems in the weekend. For the last 2.5 successive weekends, we've seen the best and the worst of people out in parts of my constituency, in and around the South Bank and the Waterloo area. And obviously that image of Patrick Hutchinson and his friends picking up that gentleman, that shows the best. A number of businesses in and around the South Bank area are concerned because whilst they're planning for their recovery, they're now seeing a level of violence around that area, and I'm worried about the police's ability to cope with that. Is there anything more that the Home Secretary could do in trying to help the Metropolitan Police in this very short interim time to get additional resources? Because officers from Lambeth and Southwark, I mentioned, are always abstracted to those major protests just to help them out so that, you know, as the businesses reopen, they don't need to also worry about the safety of visitors coming to that area.
Well, I think first of all, she's absolutely right, and I understand the concerns faced by her local businesses in light of everything that has happened recently. But I think, first of all, I speak to the Commissioner virtually every day, and I'm in touch with her and her team in terms of policing, resourcing. I frequently ask the question, is there more that is required in terms of resourcing? I hope she will lobby and work with the Mayor of London to actually further this. I think it's fair to say that more can be done in this area. Police resource and the Metropolitan Police, I'm sure the Honourable Lady will know, has had a cash increase of over £193 million and will be receiving over 1,300 new police officers. So the officers are there. The cash is there, but quite frankly, the leadership from the Mayor of London is something that certainly could improve.
Caroline Noakes.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. This afternoon we have heard from my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, her commitment to equality and to fairness. We've also heard her be extremely robust about supporting our police officers who do such a fantastic job, sometimes in incredibly difficult and dangerous circumstances. What really matters is that we take the lead from the Home Secretary and find the solutions to the inequality and unfairness that has seen these protests over the last few weeks and the awful violent actions that we saw over this weekend, and that we all work together to bring our communities closer together and addressing those inequalities that have brought about such conflict.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right, and she will know through her own work on her select committee as well, and I pay tribute to her for the work that she is undertaking, that there are a range of inequalities that cover all sorts of aspects, whether it's ethnicity, race, gender, sex, And it's right that we find ways to work together to act in a responsible way, to find the right solutions and drive the right outcomes. And I think all honourable and right honourable members of this House have a responsibility themselves to show leadership on this from our own constituencies, but actually at a national level as well, and give voice where we find injustice and inequality, but also to do right by that inequality, to find the right kind of outcomes and solutions.
Thank you, Home Secretary, for your statement today. 5-minute suspension. Order!